In this video, we're taking a look at the Carrot Cart, a 1957 Chevrolet four-door hardtop that raced in NHRA Junior Stock competition and was the 1970 Spring Nationals class champion. This car was campaigned by Don Kirkland, and you can see on the quarter panels back here that it was sponsored by Rocco and Cheater's Speed Shop in Birmingham, Alabama. Pretty famous place back in the day. Even though it's a little bit weathered, the history really remains with this car. All those old decals, the old lettering, the old wheels, everything about this car is authentic and original. And you can see under the hood here, it's got two 4s on it. It's got pretty much an identical setup to what it had in the late 60s and early 70s. It's got period correct pieces inside and out of the engine. And of course, this car is rolling on Krager SS wheels, 7-inch wide slicks on the back, just like what it would have run back in the day. And Don's still out there putting this thing through its paces. Him and his buddy Rick Pennington, they get together and go race at events like the Danchuck Tri-5 Nationals, and they have a blast with this car. I personally love that they didn't restore this car, they preserved it. This thing sat inside for lots of years, but you'll see that the paint and the lettering and the trim is weathered, but it's still there. It's one of the coolest junior stock survivors that you'll see, and it's still out there burning up the quarter mile. Next up is a really special car. This is a 69 Camaro Copo 427, and it came from the factory with 456 gears and a 4-speed transmission. This is an extremely rare combination, even amongst the Copo cars. Not many came with 456 gears. You'll see it's in Dover white. The original paint's still hanging on. All the old decals are still there, including some great event decals from the Gator Nationals and other NHRA events. You'll see some sponsor decals here, and you'll see Mills Auto Repair on the quarter panels. All that stuff was there back in the 70s when this car was being raced. The only thing that's changed in recent years is that the Keystone wheels have been taken off, and the original style steel wheels and dog dish caps have been put back on this car. But you'll see that it does have M&H Superstock slicks on the back. This thing is just like it would have raced back in the day. Even under the hood is pretty much as it was left. Not restored, not dressed up in any way. This is just like it was left when this car was taken off the racetrack many years ago. This car was delivered to Brooks Chevrolet in Millen, Georgia, and Johnny Norrell is this car's proud owner, and he displays it at many different shows. It's not drag racing anymore, but it's on display, and it's got a great story to tell because all this stuff is original to the car. Inside, you'll see a blue interior with original bucket seats. The upholstery in this thing is immaculate. You'll see that it doesn't have a console. It just has a 4-speed shifter sticking up out of the floor. And then you'll also notice this car was ordered without a radio. Very cool that this survived all these years. A small selection of Dodge Daytonas and Plymouth Superbirds were modified for drag racing. Of less than 2,000 of these Plymouth Superbirds, there were only about 100 Hemi cars. This particular car was ordered in B5 blue with wide interior. It had a bench seat and a column shifter, and it had that famous 426, 425 horsepower Hemi engine with a 727 automatic transmission. The car was ordered by Carl Gould Chrysler Plymouth in Vestal, New York, and the intention was to go drag racing from day one. And they put superstock driver Tim Richards behind the wheel. Tim Richards would go on to be a championship-winning crew chief for several drivers, including Joe Amato. Paul Messimer is noted as the car's original owner, but it's unclear whether or not he ever drove the car in competition. Paul was an employee at Carl Gould Chrysler Plymouth, and he worked directly with Tim Richards to put together a killer combination for this car. Before the car hit the track in 1970, it received a custom paint job by Bob Gertis at Circus Custom Paint. And then it had gold Carl Gould lettering down the side of the car. You can see Chrysler Plymouth there on the quarter panels. This thing had a cool 1970 look. You can see the stance is cool. It's got Keystone front runners, black steel wheels on the back with some big slicks on there. And with this car's hefty weight of nearly 4,000 pounds and a 425 horsepower rating from the factory, This power to weight ratio placed the car in the E classification of superstock. But before the car ever hit the track, it underwent some serious work. With less than 10 miles on the odometer, the original R-code Hemi was pulled out of it and replaced with a superstock legal race-prepped Hemi from Sox and Martin. Tim built the 727 automatic transmission to withstand the drag racing abuse and likely changed the rear end gears for a max effort combination through the quarter mile. The car was originally built with an 8 3/4 rear end as evidenced by the build sheet, but was later changed to a Dana 60 with 488 gears. The Superstock E automatic class was highly contested and was dominated by a big block Chevelle convertible raced by Ray Allen. Now this car found every gray area of the rule book and it was a winner. Chrysler knew this car all too well as it was putting its best combinations on the trailer on a regular basis. While there would ultimately be several Superbird drag cars across the country, there were three notable examples that jumped into the ring against the Ray Allen Chevelle. The Carl Gould Superbird was one of those cars. The car's absolute highlight was its class victory at the 1970 NHRA Summer Nationals at US 30 Dragway in York, Pennsylvania. The car raced several other times in 1970, including a trip to Indianapolis for the US Nationals. You can see a shot of it here going through the traps at Indy with the Ray Allen Chevelle beating it to the stripe by a couple of car lengths. Now, even though that Ray Allen Chevelle was full of superstock tricks that pushed the boundaries of the rulebook, this Superbird had a couple of tricks too. The rear glass in this car is double thick to add a little bit of weight over the rear tires, and then they added over 100 pounds of lead wool inside of those big wings. Those wings are already pretty heavy because they're made out of die-cast metal, so when you put 100 pounds of lead in there, these things really added a lot of ballast and a lot of weight over those rear tires. Even though this car had some good tricks, it didn't have near as many tricks as one of the other Superbirds that raced in Superstock E Automatic. Now that car belonged to Jack Wurst. Now that car had an altered wheelbase. They pushed the rear end forward a couple inches. They actually altered the front wheelbase as well by staggering the front wheels. That was to give an advantage at the starting line and the finish line beams. And then they moved the engine back, and that car had some creative weight ballast as well. So this thing was completely illegal, and it had a special 500 plus cubic inch Hemi under the hood. Now the rule books were really strict in NHRA Superstock, and the tech officials were also really strict. So if this car, the Jack Wurst car, were to ever win a race, he would be tore down and inspected. They never did because that car never won a race. He intentionally red lighted against Ray Allen Chevelle and beat the car but lost the race. And that was intentional so that he didn't get tore down by the NHRA tech officials. And by that point, the car had proven its point and moved on to other owners and into other classes. So that was just a little taste of the Jack Wurst car. Let's get back into the Carl Gould car. So after a successful 1970 season, the Carl Gould Superbird was sold in 1971 to the Carpenet brothers. Now, these guys were pretty young and they were eager to get out there in superstock competition, and they raced the Superbird under the name Infamy. Now they kept the stripe job that was done by Circus and then added their own lettering there, as we can see in this one picture in this configuration. Not many pictures exist of this car with this different lettering, because the very next year they painted this car a brand new paint job. You can see it in these pictures. Again, these are pretty rare pictures as well. This car was painted white and it had some custom striping that you can see here, but overall you can still see that this thing is set up for drag racing, even though it doesn't have the big lettering and the decals and things that it had the year prior. Around 1973, the Carpenet brothers moved on to another drag car and sold this one to Frank Obitz, who commissioned a guy known as Hank Z to do a complete repaint on it, and he gave it this psychedelic paint job that we see on this car today. So this thing has some cool striping, great color combinations, and a really cool mural on the back that we can see right here. This car has a lot of character and a lot of personality, but unfortunately we don't have any pictures of this car in its heyday with this paint job. Now we do have pictures of the car as it was discovered. We can see it here. It obviously doesn't have an engine in it. You can see the car sitting up real high, but it does have this psychedelic paint job on it. Now, this car was stashed away, obviously, for many years because the paint is just about flawless. You can't find very many flaws on this thing. It's so cool. It's got a great finish on it. Even though it's got all this age and all of this character, it still has a cool shine to it. So while Frank Obitz owned it, he pulled the Hemi out of it, put a 440 in its place. And it's not known if Frank ever drag raced this car in this configuration or how long it was even operational. It was later sold to Michael Roman, and then he sold it to Cy Behrens, who stashed this car away for many years. And most of the time this car lived in Pennsylvania. But then Mike Hill discovered this car and made an offer and was able to buy it in 2014. He installed a period correct Hemi and K-member. He put this car back together into somewhat of an operational state, and he took the car around to a lot of different shows, including McCacken in Chicago, which is a perfect home for a car of this nature. A barn find, a survivor, a rare muscle car, an old drag car, psychedelic paint job. This thing had it all. It had every bit of wow factor that you want when you go to the McCacken show. This thing was the hit of the show, and so much so that it was built into a die-cast car. Actually, two different die-cast companies built replicas of this car. So it was a major hit. It was all over the internet, and it was just a super cool piece, and Mike did a great job of piecing together the history of this thing. Even though there were some pieces like that Sox and Martin Hemi engine that he couldn't quite track down, this thing had so much cool history and a lot of great pictures to back it up. Ultimately, Mike sold the Superbird to another collector, Bob Jennings from Indiana. Bob and his crew have addressed some of the mechanical issues that this car had, but left the 1974 Hank Z paint job on it and retained the killer Day 2 tire and wheel setup with the jacked up rear suspension, the skinny keystones. I mean, this thing's got the perfect 70s look. Here's a combo the Ford guys will like, a Ford F-250 Ranger pulling a 1969 Mustang Fastback. Now this is the Platt and Payne Mustang run by Hubert Platt back in the day. This thing has been restored beautifully. Check out that paint, the lettering, the decals. You're looking at one of the greatest drag racing survivors of all time. This is a 1960 Pontiac Catalina, and it is a multi-time race winner. It's a national record holder, and it's pretty much untouched from when it stopped racing in 1971. This car was built by John Eliezer of Old Bridge, New Jersey. So the thing that really grabs your attention on this car right off the bat is the silver metal flake paint job and the words Roadrunner on the side of it. Now you got to rewind the clock a little bit. Plymouth had not come out with the Roadrunner yet when this car was painted. This car, to our knowledge, was painted in 1965 by Tinsley's Auto Body in Bellport, New York. And the lettering was done by a local sign painter. And how he got that name was because he was constantly running the roads. He was going from track to track to track. If there was a track open on Friday night and Saturday night and Sunday, he'd go to all three of them. And as you can see, this car won a lot. And you know, he raced in a pretty competitive part of the country when it came to stock eliminator. He was racing in New York and New Jersey, and that region of the country was full of junior stock eliminator cars. Cars that, like station wagons and sedan deliveries and four-door sedans, big heavy cars, you know, those classes were highly competitive. You'll see on the front fender it says mechanic work by Ralph's Garage. Well, Ralph and John are brothers, and they really put their heads together to make this car run and perform like it did. This was a national record holder in UHRA, which was a sanctioning body for National Speedway in New York. This car ran a 1340 in 1971, and that doesn't sound all that fast, but when you look at the regulations and the rules for these stock eliminator cars, that thing was flying. This is a big, heavy car, and it had some modifications, obviously, to be able to go that fast, but it was all factory type components on this car. Under the hood, it's got a 1960 model 389, which was original type engine for this car. It's bored 30 over, and it's got a set of 421 Super Duty cylinder heads on it and a Super Duty aluminum 2.4 intake manifold on it. But that's not actually what they started with. They actually started with a much simpler induction system, then stepped up to a tri-power system, and then finally went to the 2.4 system later in the 60s and early 70s. So you'll notice on this record holder certificate, it says it ran a 1420 in G stock automatic trim, and that was in September of 1970. Well, the next one that we see from the United Hot Rod Association, it says Johnny Leeser, August of 1971, and the car ran a 1340, almost a full second difference in just about a year's time. Still running in the same class, G stock automatic, but I'm thinking that this is probably when the induction system changed from the tri-power setup to the 2.4s, because that was a huge gain. That's definitely interesting to see that big of an improvement in just a year's time in such a strict class as the stock eliminator category. The car's got a turbo hydromatic 4-speed transmission in it, 411 gears out back. It's got old school traction bars, and it even has airbags in the coil springs to keep it from transferring too much weight onto the rear end. That kind of stiffened things up a little bit so that the car would launch and hook off of the line. And pretty much the only thing that's been replaced on this car, as you can see, front to back, this thing's original, but those rear tires, those are modern Hoosier slicks on the back of this thing. This car is perfectly preserved. The old floor mat, the upholstery, everything is just perfect. It does have an aftermarket steering wheel in it, and then you can see this 8,000 RPM tach. It still works, it's still there. This is just 100% original stuff from the 1960s. And you'll notice that it doesn't have a roll bar in it. It didn't need it. It wasn't that fast of a car. And a lot of these stock eliminator cars, I mean, they were required to continue having stock interior, stock glass. They weren't allowed to replace it with Lexan or plexiglass or anything like that. These cars had to appear to be stock. And you can see on the door jamb here that this car was a street car for a little while. John bought this car new in 1960 and drove it on the street a little bit. You can see the oil change stickers here on the door jamb. Can't really see any dates or any real specific information there, but it's proof that this thing, it was just a street car for a while and then started a whole new life around 1964. And just so many cool details, including these wheels and tires. These are the original wheels. Now they have been painted silver. They were originally chrome, but just so much cool stuff that's still surviving on this thing. And then just looking through the album that Tim has on this thing, so many pieces of this car's history, including Tinsley's Auto Painting, Ralph's Garage, just these business cards. These things have survived all these years, and they were in this car. And this scrapbook is just so cool. It has so many neat pieces like this New York National Speedway pit pass and handwritten time slips from Lebanon Valley Dragway and New York National Speedway. You'll see there it's running in the low 14s, and it's running in the I stock automatic class, and then it looks like J automatic. I'm assuming that's a J stock automatic class, but just some really cool pieces of this car's history. Then we've got Dover Drag Strip, Englishtown, you've got Madison Township Raceway Park. All of these little pieces were inside of this car. And then they were able to find some pictures, including this great picture that shows another 1960 Pontiac that was the tow car for this 1960 Pontiac race car. And speaking of being flat towed, that was some other parts that came with this car. The original tow bar came with it, and the hubs. It had freewheeling hubs to put on the back of it so that it wouldn't be, spinning the rear end and all the drivetrain and all that kind of stuff. It was a pretty popular addition back in the day, and this car had them, and it still has them. He's still got those hubs from way back in the 1960s. Also in the trunk were a collection of rule books. These included NHRA, AHRA, and UHRA sanctioning bodies. All had different rules packages, and he was really studying this stuff to try to stay on top of the rules because they change from year to year as far as the weight breaks, the class designations, all that kind of stuff was something that was just kind of on a sliding scale. So he was really up on all of this. And you'll also see that he's got this Pontiac engine book, and he said that this was kind of his guide to making that Pontiac 389 perform as well as it did. Another interesting detail is this car is still wearing its original license plates. Pontiac magazine called Smoke Signals did a huge article on this car, did a beautiful photo shoot on it, showed all of the old school pictures, all the old information that you could ever want. They did several pages, I think about 10 pages as far as the feature is concerned, and did a great job on it. So many great details in here, and it just really does this car justice. I mean, this is a significant car that went completely hidden for lots of years, decades. This car completely just sat and nobody knew about it from 1972 until about 2011. The Tri-5 Nationals always brings out a great field of cars to compete in the Junior Stock Eliminator. Now, originally, back in the 60s, this Junior Stock category was basically anything lower than Super Stock. So any of your B Stock or C Stock or L Stock or any of those cars would be considered a Junior Stock. So the Tri-5s really fell into that category because these were often pretty heavy cars with small cubic inches. So a lot of times they might fall into the O category, sometimes the P category, just depending on the engine combination. But you'll see a lot of historic cars in this group that are battling it out on the quarter mile just like they did back in the 60s. Moving into 1962, things really started to change for Robert Nance. He was still running the 32 Ford with the Mopar engine in the gas class, but he bought a brand new 1962 Plymouth. And this was a very special partnership with Plymouth because this was a very special car. This was one of the first of the factory drag cars. It was a 62 Plymouth with a 413 cubic inch engine, 13.5 to 1 compression, and an advertised 420 horsepower. This was a revolutionary car, and Robert was able to get his hands on this thing because he was a factory Plymouth racer. I don't have any confirmed pictures of Robert Nance's 62 Plymouth Max Wedge car, but this 62 Plymouth Max Wedge car was photographed at Harriman Drag Strip. So not many of these things floating around at that point. So considering this is photographed at a nearby track, I'm using it as a very clear example of what Robert Nance's 62 Plymouth may have looked like back in the day. He took this car to Hickson Drag Strip. It only had 270 miles on it according to this article, and he went out there and won with it. This car ran 12.45 seconds in the quarter mile, and then only 2 weeks later he knocked that ET down to 12:39. So this car absolutely ran away with all of the stock eliminator races in this local area. So he started going to bigger races, started branching out a little bit, going and traveling to races, and the car continued to do well. And because of this relationship with Plymouth, he had to report back every time he went to a race to tell them what the car ran, what kind of issues he may have come up with, or what kind of problems the car had, and what kind of success that he had. So he would report back every week to his representative there at Plymouth and talk about what he did, what went well, what didn't, and they would make changes based on racer input. So this led to some huge opportunities moving forward with Robert Nance's career. So moving into 1963, he got a brand new 1963 Plymouth, another factory car, lightweight components, big 426 Max Wedge engine. This thing was completely as fast as you could get when it came to a factory produced car. And he had a lot of success with it as well. Meanwhile, he was still competing in the A-gas category with a 1940 Willis Coupe. Now, he partnered up with Red Stanley on this car. Again, this was a very competitive car, and it had a very high horsepower combination in it. Again, Mopar powered, of course. And this car went on to win a lot of races locally at Paradise Drag Strip, Hickson Drag Strip, all over the Southeast. This car was very competitive in the A-gas ranks. And even in this poster, you can see that they put out a bounty on Red Stanley with that 40 Willis Coupe. So during all of this, he's got two cars running simultaneously, one in the gas coupe and sedan class and one in the superstock ranks. Both cars are winning races on a regular basis, and he's just continuing to build upon this success by every single year getting another new factory-produced car. So 1964 comes along, and that's when the Hemi comes out. The very first 426 Hemi was available in those 1964 Superstock cars. 1964 is also when the Mr. Plymouth nickname came along, and you can see it lettered on the door of the 64 Hemi car, and you can also see designations of the aluminum fenders. You can also see a designation of Hemi on the sail panel. So this car definitely stood out compared to his previous cars. You'll see all that nice lettering, and in the color pictures, you'll notice the light blue paint job and yellow steel wheels. That was an odd combination that definitely got a lot of attention, but it doesn't really come through on these black and white pictures. So when 1965 comes along, Robert actually keeps the two cars. He's got a 64 car and a 65 car, and he's running them both simultaneously, one in Superstock and one in AFX. Here's a cool shot from 1965 at Union Hill Drag Strip in Nashville, Tennessee. And you can see in this picture, you've got two Mr. Plymouth cars. The one ahead is the number 2 car. That's the AFX 65 car. The one in the background is the 64 car, which at this time was still running in Superstock, but would later switch to different classes. But also in this picture, you've got James Lake and Robert Nance. They're standing together in that back row, and you can see the Nance's logo on their shirt, that oval logo. And these guys traveled all over the Southeast together, running these companion cars and eventually running other cars together. So, you know, they were not only good racers, but they were good friends, and they put their heads together on these cars and were very successful. So early in 1965, that's when the altered wheelbase cars hit the scene at Beeline Dragway in Arizona, and that's when things just started changing across the country with the AFX class. One of Robert's biggest wins of the 1965 season came in Greenville, South Carolina. They raced at the Donaldson Air Force Base, and he beat them all. He beat all the big names, and he's running this car in top stock Eliminator, but this thing is technically an AFX car, and this is actually before they got carried away with modifications to kind of keep up with the pace of that AFX class. So no altered wheelbase, no fuel injection at this point, no wild modifications. This was a relatively stock car. He took home $1,400 for that win, plus this giant trophy that is still on display to this day with Robert Nance's grandson in a little mini museum of artifacts from Robert's career. 1968 was another big opportunity for Robert Nance because he got his hands on a BO-29 Barracuda. Now, these BO-29 cars were factory-produced drag cars. They had fiberglass body components. They had a 426 Hemi with cross ram, 2.4s, the whole 9 yards. These cars were very competitive in the Superstock ranks, and he painted his car blue, a little bit different shade than what he had been previously running with the earlier Mr. Plymouth cars. And you'll see the font has changed on the lettering. Now he's got a little more of just a block style font, and this car, even though it looks simple, this thing was very competitive. So during the 1968 season, he campaigned the Barracuda as well as the long-nose Barracuda funny car. He split driving duties with James Lake, and they would run this car in Superstock as well as modified production, and they even continued to run it when Pro Stock became a thing. After the Barracuda funny car was phased out, Robert actually brought back a 65 model car to run in Superstock C automatic. So the 65 Hemi car was another potent combination, and he actually painted this car red for the 1969 season, a very unusual combination for him because previously all of his cars had been blue. And this car didn't stay that way for very long, maybe just a year or so, and he went back to the blue combination on all of his cars. But this car, again, even with the red, it was still a very competitive car, and you'll see it here at Harriman Drag Strip in Harriman, Tennessee, which had a very successful year in 1969 with some really big Superstock races. And he made a couple of trips up there in '69 and continued his Southeast tour, just going from place to place, taking home as much money as he could. He ended up selling the BO-29 Barracuda to some friends there in Ringgold. The Crawford brothers ended up with this car, and they repainted it, and they raced it locally and ended up selling it, and it moved on. And that car still lives on to this day. It's a modern-day Hemi Superstocker, and really neat that that thing still exists, a legitimate BO-29 car with roots in this area. But when the Pro Stock car sort of fizzled out around 1973, he ended up selling that car to a local racer, George Brown, who renamed it the Candyman, kept the 426 Hemi. This was still a pretty fast car for the day, but it was no longer in the Pro Stock ranks. Around this time, Robert bought another Duster, and this time the intentions were to run in Superstock. And he was going to build a small block. It was going to be in one of the lower Superstock classes. And as it all shook out, it ended up being a Superstock K automatic. So it was a 1973 Plymouth Duster 340. So in the Superstock ranks, he could run that 340 engine and be legit for 1973 specifications. That put him in the K designation. And then he could actually change this car to a 74 with just a couple of body modifications, and run a 360 and run in superstock J automatic. So he had kind of a configurable combination on this car where he could switch it back and forth if he wanted to, but it spent most of its time as a superstock K. So as you can see, this car has a much larger back tire on it, and these superstock cars kept the leaf springs, so they would run superstock style leaf springs instead of going with a 4-link and narrowed rear end. This was kind of the normal combination for the mid-70s. During this time, Robert was also running a 65 car. You can see this thing has been updated. It's got the big tires on the back. The paint jobs kind of match with each other. The lettering on the door is similar. So this was still kind of a team situation with 2 cars running. And by this point, James Lake had moved on and Robert hired other drivers. And one of the main drivers for this Duster was Jerry Bryant. He drove this car and won a lot of races there locally in Ringgold. And by this point, the traveling had really slowed down. Robert and Jerry raced locally there at Brainerd Optimus Drag Strip and Drag City, but as far as traveling out, that didn't happen quite as often. So we fast forward quite a few years, all the way to 1984, late in the season, kind of the end of the drag racing season. Robert decides to sell his last car, the Plymouth Duster, and all of his racing equipment, all of his tools, all of his stuff, to just get out of the racing world altogether. And he sold all of that stuff to Stuart Way down in the Atlanta area. And Stuart took the car and he repainted it. And there was some things that needed to be addressed on the body where the fenders and the doors had been acid dipped. There was a little bit of damage there. And he ended up taking the doors off the car, replacing them with another pair of doors. And he brought that Mr. Plymouth door back to Robert and gave it to him just as a memento to his racing career, something he could hang on his shop wall or something like that. And I was lucky to see this door hanging on the wall. It's actually in his grandson's business. He has sort of a mini museum of Robert Nance stuff. He's got trophies, he's got pictures, he's got some paperwork from those early days of his Plymouth arrangement in 1962. He's got all sorts of really neat stuff in here, and I was really thankful to be able to see this stuff in person. And you know, that brings me to another point. I'm really thankful for Joey Crawford. Joey stepped in and told me a lot about this Plymouth Duster and about a lot of different cars that Robert Nance had run through the years. So really neat to kind of see how things had changed and still see how things had remained the same. And while we were there, Joey was delivering one of the old parachutes that Robert Nance used on the AFX car. And Joey really helped me with gathering some of these pictures and some of the information, especially on that Duster, because he's involved with the modern rendition of the Duster, which is now owned by Dan Began. He runs this car at Nostalgia Races, and he's got it set up just like the old days. It's set up with a small block Mopar in there. It's got aluminum heads on it. It's still got leaf springs out back. It's still got those 1432s on the back. You know, this thing is set up just like it would have been back in the day. So I got to see this car run at Brainerd Drag Strip. He was running down in the 7s, and Joey was actually the one driving it. So, you know, they have a pretty good package here. This car is not lightning fast. It's not breaking any records, but it's doing what it always did. It's consistent. He's going out there and having fun with it. And my favorite part about it is that it still has the Mr. Plymouth legacy. So this car, even though it got painted when Stuart Way had it, it got painted yellow and black, he ended up selling this car to Jerry Bryant, which was a previous driver for Robert Nance. He sold it to Jerry in 1986, and Jerry ended up adding Mr. Plymouth to the door, even with the yellow and black paint job. So this car was carrying that Mr. Plymouth name for many, many years. And then Jerry ended up selling it to Robert Nance's son, Bobby, and Bobby had it repainted, put the blue paint job on it, just solid blue, no stripes or anything, and then put Mr. Plymouth on the doors. And then it ended up getting sold to Dan Began. So, you know, this car's been through several different owners, but I'm so glad to see that that Mr. Plymouth is still on the doors. It's still got this cool retro paint job. You know, this thing really has a good look to it. And unfortunately, Dan ended up wrecking the car. He had an issue with the engine and ended up bumping the guardrail and messed up those acid-dipped fenders. He put a straight style early bumper on there instead of the big 73, 74 style bumper, and kind of gave this thing a refresh. You can see it's got a little bit brighter color blue on the stripes. It's got some really nice work on this thing. It's got a great look. So to see a historical car that was once owned by a local racing legend still out there making passes, still putting a smile on people's faces, that is what it's all about. got another Mopar. This is a 1967 Plymouth Belvedere. This is a 426 Hemi with a 4-speed. This was Judy Lilly's car, a famous Mopar drag racer from back in the 60s and 70s. She campaigned it for only one season, 1967, a brand new car, but it was sold and kind of lost for lots of years and ended up coming back. It was in a Hot Rod magazine ad back in the day when they had black and white classifieds in the back of the book, and this thing was bought and then eventually restored to the condition you see here. Here's another really cool combination. We've got a yellow and white 57 Chevrolet Nomad. Check out that tow bar. Hooked up to the Nomad, hooked up to the 57 behind it. You'll see it has a custom tube grille, fender well headers, you can see those poking out, 2 4s on a small block Chevy. This car ran in junior stock, which was pretty common in the late 60s and very early 70s. This car actually ran in H stock automatic, which put it in that junior stock eliminator. But this thing is a true survivor. And you can see on the door it says Chambers Chomper, and that comes from the driver's name, Larry Chambers. He was based out of the Memphis, Tennessee area, so he raced at tracks like Lakeland International Raceway, Carlisle Drag Strip in Arkansas, Hall's Drag Strip. He even raced at Bristol, which was kind of a long haul, all the way across the state of Tennessee, and raced at the U.S. Nationals in Indy. This car was raced from 1965 through 1969, and it was a class champion in 1968. And according to the information, it's a 283 cubic inch engine, 2 4s of course, and a Power Glide transmission built by Coleman and Taylor, which was a Memphis-based transmission place. And in the trunk, you'll see lots of cool pictures and information and old passes and trophies and things like that of when this thing was running back in the day. This is the one and only factory commissioned drag truck that came out of Ford Motor Company. So to tell the whole story on this truck, we got to back up a couple of years to see the factory involvement in NHRA drag racing. The stock eliminator classes would often showcase what a production model could do, and these classes were filled with rules that prevented any extreme modifications. And the factories got behind this because obviously if a Ford was winning on Sunday, they'd sell more of them on Monday. And the same could be said for General Motors, the Chrysler Corporation, but Ford was definitely a front runner in factory involvement. They had special equipment that would put them within the rules package that NHRA put together, but some of these combinations were a little outside of the lines, so NHRA came up with a class called Factory Experimental, and that allowed the factories to obviously experiment a little bit, try a different engine combination, maybe not something that was exactly production ready, but something that had production type parts in it. And let's not confuse this version of Factory Experimental with the AFX classes from the mid-60s on. From 1965 and beyond, Factory Experimental was really just out of control and turned into what we now know as funny car racing. But before 1965, it was a whole different ballgame, and the factories were really getting behind it with some specially prepared cars. Ford, in the early 60s, started producing cars with lightweight body panels, big engines, special components from front to back. They were really getting behind this program. And in preparation for the 1963 drag racing season, they wanted to build a truck. So they commissioned a prototype be built by Dearborn Steel Tubing. Now DST is kind of a household name when it comes to old drag cars because they were the ones responsible for building the Ford Thunderbolt. Now before the Thunderbolt project came about, they built one 1963 Ford F100 pickup truck. The F100 XL was a project that took a $2,600 base model truck and added a $3,400 package on top of that. So you're talking about big money for this specially prepared drag truck. And what was involved in the DST conversion was a long list of items. It started with the front suspension. They changed out the springs for 1,100-pound front springs with 90-10 shocks. Pretty revolutionary stuff in 1963, by the way. Out back it had 1,650-pound rear springs with 50/50 shocks, a 9-inch housing, a power lock differential with 486 gears. This thing had custom traction bars that were made out of giant Ford tie rod ends that came off of a heavy-duty Ford truck, and they actually went toward the back of the truck, where most traction bars you see now on leaf springs, like Caltrac bars for instance, they go to the front leaf spring perch. Well, these went to the rear of the truck, and served the same purpose, where they just wanted to control that axle wrap. And another thing they did to try to control the axle wrap was they flipped the rear end housing to the other side of the springs, and not only did that lower the ride height, it also helped control some of that axle wrap. Let's keep in mind in 1963 that tire technology wasn't what it is today, and there was hardly any track prep. Basically, the only track prep you'd get was a broom sweeping some of the dust off of the surface. So weight transfer was a really big deal on these factory-produced cars and trucks. And in this case, they moved the fuel tank out of the cab and into the rear of the frame, behind the rear end housing. That put a little extra weight back there, and that was a custom 14-gallon tank. Now, you don't need 14 gallons to go drag racing. It's obvious that you only need a couple of gallons to make it through the pits, make it pass, make it back to your pit. But they put 14 gallons so that you had a little extra weight back there, helping any way they could to get some traction. They use M&H 915 slicks, and they mounted those to widened steel wheels. They're 15 by 8.5 inches. Up front, it had just some stock steel wheels and 670/15 bi-spline tires. The power plant for this truck was Ford's top dog at the time, the 427, 425 horsepower combination. It had a set of Bellinger-tuned headers on it, and it was backed by a T10 4-speed manual transmission. Some of the special things about the F100XL were the cosmetic details. This thing was not your standard Ford pickup truck, and it was partially created to help promote a special version of a factory truck that you could get. You could get bucket seats and a console. You could get some nice ornamental things, and it wasn't just all about performance. It was more of an appearance package. But as you'll notice on this truck, it had beige paint and it had a black vinyl top. It had red pinstripes. This truck was certainly built to be a showpiece and not just something that was getting beat up on the drag strip, even though they took this truck to 10 different drag strips to prepare it for the U.S. Nationals in 1963. But the idea with this 10-track tour was to work out all the bugs so that they could show up at Indy and compete with the field. Now, this truck, because of its weight of 3,825 pounds and because of its cubic inches and horsepower rating, it put it into the B category of the factory experimental class. And of course, I have to mention that there were a few trucks in this class. The BFX class had a few Dodge trucks in competition. So of course, Ford wanted to get in the game and obviously outrun the Dodge boys. So this was going to be their piece to take to Indianapolis and compete against the Dodge boys and of course all the other cars in the factory experimental class. During this time, the truck was lettered with Stu Wilson Ford on the quarter panel areas, and they were based out of Dearborn, Michigan. And this was pretty normal back in the day to list a dealership with one of these factory-produced cars, even though Stu Wilson Ford didn't necessarily have anything to do with the truck itself. So at this time, it was being driven by Jack Fuchs. Now, he went by the nickname Skinny, and he was an employee of Dearborn Steel Tubing. On the front fender, the names Wayne Feitzer and Don Heitz are listed as mechanics. During this 10-track test run, the truck's best ET in mile an hour happened at Detroit Dragway, and it was a 1272 at 108 miles per hour. Now, this is an interesting piece of literature. This is an ad that says, "Want a hot drag machine or a beautiful tow truck? It is now possible to order an F100 pickup with a Galaxy XL bucket seat interior. Downtown Ford, Los Angeles, California." Well, Downtown Ford had nothing to do with this truck, the Stu Wilson truck. This was an advertisement to try to gain some interest on additional F100 XL trucks being built, and that never happened. Now, this piece of literature tells you exactly what it takes to order an F100 XL. Now, it starts with a base model F100 pickup truck, 114-inch wheelbase, style side box, 223 six-cylinder engine, just your standard stuff. And then it gets sent to Dearborn Steel Tubing, who adds the 427, the 2.4s, the 4-speed, all of those custom items to make this thing a drag truck. And it says right here, Dearborn Steel Tubing Company's conversion price, $3,400. Now, that was on top of the purchase price of the truck. So this was a very expensive piece, and it's obvious that this thing didn't take off. There weren't any others produced in this exact configuration. So this truck's biggest potential moment was at the 1963 U.S. Nationals. This is where all the photographers were. This is where all the media coverage was going to happen. And this truck went to the line and made one pass that we know of. We see evidence right here from the starting line at Indianapolis. But this truck actually broke on the way to a magazine photo shoot and couldn't come back and compete. It was just a big letdown because this truck had so much potential. But at that point, that's kind of when the guys at DST let go of this truck. They stopped the continual testing, they moved on. At this point, the truck was sold for an undisclosed amount of money, and it went from Detroit to the state of Delaware. And the new owner, Jack Whitby, owned a Ford dealership called Friendly Ford in Wilmington, Delaware. This truck was sold to Jack Whitby with a bill of origin. It had no title whatsoever. The obvious concerns and liability reasons meant that this was just going to be a drag truck, and if anything, it were to be destroyed at the end of its life cycle. He bought this thing as a promotional piece to try to help spur some interest in this new XL product line that Ford was coming out with. And he took this thing out and raced it himself, and according to some of his literature, this thing made 17 starts and had 17 wins. It won at every single race it entered in the B factory experimental class. So all of this takes place in fall of 1963. The U.S. Nationals occurred in early September, and by November of 1963, this truck was listed for sale in the newspaper for a price of $3,295. And it says in the ad, built by the Ford Motor Company, experimental racing division at a cost of $15,000 with a minimum of modifications to the F100 XL can be converted to run on the street. Contact Jack Whitby's Friendly Ford Sales, Wilmington, Delaware. Now, that's where the story gets a little bit fuzzy, because remember, this thing was sold to Jack Whitby without a title, and it was a race-only vehicle. So now we're at the end of the 1963 season, and this truck has already done a lot. It's seen a lot, it's done a lot, and it's now for sale by Jack Whitby. And Jack Whitby was actually one of the selected dealerships that had access to the Ford Thunderbolt, which was going to be coming out. It was a 64 Ford Fairlane, and this is the end of 63. So the guy who put down the deposit on the Thunderbolt that Jack Whitby ordered was Bill Nodane. Now, he allegedly sold 13 cows in order to put down this deposit on the Thunderbolt, and although I don't have proof of this, it would appear that Bill got a little bit impatient while waiting on that car to be delivered. And when the truck became available, he transferred his funds from the Thunderbolt deposit over to buy this truck. And he took the truck and raced it for a few years. He modified the truck to fit his liking. He had some health issues with his legs, so he couldn't do the 4-speed. He switched it over to an automatic and even put a 427 Cammer in this truck at some point. Now, here's a really interesting picture. This is something that I just happened to stumble across, and it is a picture of the F100 XL pulling a boat. So obviously Bill did drive this truck on the street. After it got done with his drag racing career, he put this thing back into street mode. And this truck, even though it was very special to him, he eventually parked it. He just put it in the shed. He moved on to tractor pulling, he moved on to other things, and this truck just remained in his garage. And part of the reason why this truck didn't come out and get displayed very often was because Bill started getting letters from Ford Motor Company about the 1963 Ford F100 XL. They were looking for it. They didn't know that Jack Whitby had gotten a title for it. They didn't know all of these things had transpired, so they were looking for their truck. And probably not looking for it to own it necessarily, but probably just looking for it to be off the road. Bill keeps getting these letters, and he continues to ignore them because that's his truck. He bought it fair and square. He paid his hard-earned money for it. He got a title for it. It's in his name. So he keeps this truck for years and years and years. And it's just kind of one of those things that's a conversation piece. It's something he tells stories about his racing days, and obviously about this truck that Ford Motor Company wants back. It was a local legend, and it gained even more notoriety when Bill started bringing it back out into the public. And he did that because a friend of his, John Morris, helped him drag it out of the shed, get it cleaned up, get it running again, and put this thing back out in front of the public so that he could tell its story and he could kind of show it off, because this truck had been hidden away for so long that it was kind of a forgotten piece of Ford racing history. Unfortunately, Bill passed away a few years ago, and his good friend John Morris took ownership of this truck, and he's got all the great memorabilia to go with it, the documentation, and of course some trophies. One of these says Georgetown Dragway 1964, another one says NASCAR Spring Nationals, which happened in Richmond, Virginia at that time, 1966. So this truck raced at least until 1966, but that's about when things started fizzling out in Bill's drag racing career. And at present day, this truck has 2,983 miles on it, and it is preserved wonderfully. This extremely rare factory lightweight 1962 Pontiac Catalina. Now they call these cars a 421 Super Duty, and that's because they had a special engine, special everything. These cars were factory built race cars. They were really going after the superstock class. So these cars had very trick components to reduce weight, and that included an aluminum hood, aluminum inner and outer front fenders, aluminum front and rear bumpers, and a special frame. So these things were absolutely custom factory built pieces. And obviously they had a 421 cubic inch engine. It was only rated at 405 horsepower, which back in the day, superstock, that was how they designated your class, was by your advertised horsepower. So 405 advertised horsepower, these things probably made more like 450, maybe even higher than that, because they were pretty stout engines. So this car is one of less than 200 built, and it says on the signboard that this is the Ted Ware Pontiac Catalina that was drag raced in the New England area in the early 60s. I love that it's got the little skinny white wall tires, the black steel wheels and dogdish caps, and then if you look inside, it's still got the factory type interior. It does have some auxiliary gauges under the dash and a tack strapped to the steering column. Look at the black paint on this car. This thing is slick as it can be. This is a truly period correct piece with some old school paint, very cool old decals on the windows, lots of old details on this car that help tell its story and tell some of its history from back in the 60s and 70s. So you'll see inside this thing is pretty much stock. There's nothing really gutted out here. That tells us this thing was probably running in a type of super stock class or maybe stock eliminator of some type. And you can see on the front fenders it's lettered the Mystery Indian. Now, this car's got serious history in New York State, and it currently lives in Georgia. But look at all these old pictures. You can see the old paint, you can see the mismatched wheels, you can see the old trophies from Dover Drag Strip in Wingdale, New York. This is a cool piece of drag racing history. Under the hood, it's got a 421 with tri-power induction. You can see it's had a few updates. You can see a modern MSD box and things like that. But for the most part, this car's got the right look. You can see the red line tires with, I believe those are Fenton wheels on the front. This car's got the original lettering, the original paint is still intact, and of course, those decals on the quarter windows, just so cool. But inside, you can see again, there's been a couple of updates. There's still an original old school tack on the steering column. They've added a monster tack to the dash, but otherwise, it's all together. And look at this, the old helmet. It's still got the same artwork that you'll see on the quarter panel of the car. That is original to this car's racing days back in the 60s and 70s. Pretty awesome to see that that survived, and just that this car in general survived. It is a really cool piece. This is a 64 Ford Fairlane, and if you're thinking Thunderbolt, you're thinking right. I mean, this has got all the ingredients for a great Thunderbolt build. You'll see it has that super basic interior with those little lightweight bucket seats. These things were stripped down sedans, and this one happens to have a 4-speed in it. And then when we go under that teardrop hood, we see a 427 based FE big block. And this particular one has an aluminum block. It's been stroked to 503 cubic inches. It's got two Holley 850s on it. This thing makes 726 horsepower. It's owned by Jimmy Vaughn. It's a pretty fresh car, and it's got a really cool look with those plain steel wheels. This thing looks like a Thunderbolt, but makes a lot more horsepower. They had really good success with the 63 Max Wedge car, so they stepped up to a 64 Max Wedge car a few years later and didn't have quite as much success with it. They didn't love the car quite as much. It just didn't work as well. It was another Max Wedge car. It was another really highly sought after car, but they eventually sold it after a couple of years. And it went on to run around here locally under different ownership in the superstock ranks. You know, they were really getting serious about racing. And Milburn actually worked at Austin Motors, which is on Broad Street in downtown Chattanooga. And he worked there in the shop. He had access to a lot of good parts, a lot of good cars. And in late 1969, he bought a brand new 1970 Plymouth Cuda, 440 six-pack car with an automatic. He ordered it specifically to go drag racing. He was going to continue to race in the superstock ranks, and he was going to go up against the cars that were, really paving the way for the new era of superstock. Cars like the LS6 Chevelle, and Ford had a few contenders, but it was really that big block Chevelle that encouraged him to make this purchase. When Milburn bought it, he drove the car around a little bit, and he drove it home, which is about 25 miles from where he worked. And that was really about it as far as that car's street life. So he immediately took it in the garage. He started changing stuff on it. He changed the rear end gear. He changed, exhaust and whatever was legal for superstock at the time. So he made minimal changes. He didn't put a roll cage in it. He didn't gut out the interior. It was factory seats, factory dash, factory steering wheel, factory everything in this car, aside from a cable drive tachometer. So, to look inside this car, it was just like looking inside an all original car. And I made sure to take a picture and get my eyeballs on that odometer that said 149 miles. And I wanted to get the story on that, because even if you drag race this thing and only went a quarter mile at a time, you would eventually get more than 149 miles on it. But he said that once he changed out the rear end gear, that it made the speedometer so crazy that he just decided to unhook the cable. So the 149 miles was basically the little bit of street driving that he did. So where this really gets interesting is, I told you that this was a 440 six-pack car originally. Milburn had the opportunity to put his hands on a lot of really good cars. One of those cars was a 1967 Plymouth GTX convertible with a factory Hemi in it. This is one of 17 cars. And he was able to buy the GTX convertible from the dealership and take it home, pull that Hemi engine out of there, and use it for his race car. Part of the reasoning for wanting a Hemi engine in the Barracuda was that it was a factory option. It would allow him to stay in the superstock ranks. The cubic inches was actually less than what he was running, 440 versus 426, and that allowed him to run in the superstock D automatic class, which was highly contested in 1970 through about 74. I mean, this was a tough class to compete in. Milburn and David raced this car for a few years, but they could see the writing on the wall. They could see that drag racing was moving away from its grassroots and going into more of, whoever has the most money wins the most races. And in their case, they didn't want to go broke trying to win. So they did what any other crazy Mopar guy would do, and they parked that car in his basement and never touched it again. Milburn parked this car in 1974, and even though I had an opportunity to see it, I still didn't see it in the sunshine. I didn't see it cleaned up. I didn't see the real potential of this car. I saw it, as a true barn find or basement find, whatever you want to call it. I saw it as a car that just hadn't been touched. It hadn't even been wiped off in 40 years. And we've got the king of the Fords right here. Now, I had to do a little bit of studying to try to figure out the history, because I just love the history of old drag cars. And I knew that I've seen some pictures of a Phil Bonner Ford Thunderbolt that had been wrecked badly back when it was new. And I had to figure out whether this car we're looking at here was a tribute or whether it had been rebuilt out of the crashed, crumpled sheet metal of that original car. So as I got to looking, Phil Bonner actually had two Ford Thunderbolts, and the one we're looking at today is neither of those cars. So the first Thunderbolt he had was a very early production. He got it in 1963 and hit the ground running, started racing this car hard. And during this time, he had a 64 Ford Falcon that he was racing, also 427 powered. And while Phil was out racing his Falcon, one of his crew guys, Jimmy Evans, took the Thunderbolt out to Paradise Drag Strip in Calhoun, Georgia, had a mishap and ended up rolling the car, completely destroyed it. There's pictures of it here. You can see the body was just mangled. And as the story goes, Jimmy Evans was never to be seen again. Phil never saw him again, was never able to talk to him about what happened. All he knew was that his car was destroyed and it was time to pick up the pieces. So ultimately, he ordered another one. He got a second Thunderbolt, and a lot of them got cut up into AFX cars and altered wheelbase cars. And that's exactly what happened with the number 2 Thunderbolt. It actually got the wheelbase altered a little bit. It raced under a couple different identities and ultimately sat in a barn for many, many years, not too far away from Phil Bonner's house. He knew the car was there, but could never come to an agreement on a price, so he ended up building his own. And that's what we're looking at here today in Dawsonville. This is a very authentic recreation of a 1964 Thunderbolt. This car is built with authentic parts, and it's built with a very authentic look. We'll see that it's got some American Racing torque thrust wheels, which in a lot of cases these cars just ran steel wheels. But other than that, this thing looks like it's straight out of 1964. You can see it's got a lot of cool hand lettering that's just like the original car. And even though this particular car doesn't have a lot of drag racing history with Phil, it still has a lot of those stories wrapped up in it. The stories of the original Thunderbolt, the stories of the second Thunderbolt, and all of the different Ford drag cars that were campaigned by Phil Bonner throughout the 1960s. This car continues to tell those stories, and it's still in the Bonner family, so that's really cool. When it comes to factory drag cars, one of the most popular and mysterious examples is Chevrolet's Impala Z11 package. Only about 50 of these cars were produced, and just a handful of those still exist, making them extremely rare and extremely valuable and very important pieces of drag racing history. And the one we're looking at today is a faithful recreation of Wally Bell's New York Shaker, which is by far the most well-traveled Z11 as it passed from owner to owner, state to state, but it ultimately met its demise in an Iowa scrapyard in the 1970s. So before I get too carried away, I want to say a huge thank you to all the people who have been researching these cars for years. There's a group of guys that just live and breathe these Z11 cars, but I wanted to just make sure everybody knows that this isn't my research, this is somebody else's research that has led to the history of this car. So let's go back to this car's earliest days, and that's when it was sold through Cobb Motor Company in Goldsboro, North Carolina. This car was originally sold in January of 1963, and it ran for a very short amount of time under John Hollingsworth. You'll see Big John lettered on the front fenders. You'll also see those 427 cubic inch designations on the fenders, very important part of the Z11 package. And you'll also see that this car had a very special hood scoop on it. Details are a little bit fuzzy during the early days because this car was owned for a very short amount of time by the original owner. It's said that James Cook was the original owner and he sold the car just a few months after buying it. It went down into Georgia and became the Georgia Shaker, raced by Hubert Platt, who would later switch to Ford and continued to run Fords for many, many years. But for 1963, he raced this very special Z11 Impala. And it's said to have been owned by Alan Hyder during this time, or at least financially backed by Alan Hyder. You can see that the lettering has changed dramatically. It's got cross flags on the doors. It's got big Georgia Shaker on the quarter panel. You'll also see designations of Nally Chevrolet in Atlanta, Georgia, and Dyno Don Nicholson is said to have prepared this car. So it had a few custom pieces that Dyno Don was known for. In a couple of these shots, you'll see that it's got some long traction bars that run up toward the front of the car. That wasn't factory, that was added more than likely by Dyno Don, and I'm sure Dyno Don went through this engine and blueprinted it and got every ounce of horsepower you could get out of it. Hubert Platt started racing this car in the middle of the 1963 season, and he put it on tour in the Southeast. I mean, he was at multiple tracks a weekend, going from place to place for superstock meets, factory experimental classes, match races, anything he could do to go race his car, he was running it hard. And by the end of the 1963 season, he had struck his deal with Ford, so he was actually campaigning a Chevrolet and a factory-backed Ford at the same time for a very short amount of time. But eventually, he stuck with the Ford and sold the Chevrolet to Wally Bell. So by the time it had made it to Wally Bell, this car had been worked on pretty extensively, and you can even see, going back to the Georgia Shaker configuration, you can even see some damage because those aluminum fenders and aluminum bumpers were really fragile, and just leaning over them to work on the car would actually create dents and damage on those front fenders. So Wally freshened it up a little bit. He put his own lettering on there, New York Shaker, and left the cross flags. You can see the Monaco blue paint is still on there, and you can see that hood scoop had changed a little bit in that 1 year period. A couple other small changes, but for the most part, this still looked like a factory 63 Impala. So Wally raced the car in the Northeast during the 1964 season, and then he put it up for sale early in 1965. So the car sold to Jack Schaefer in Pennsylvania, and to our knowledge, Jack never raced this car. He actually ended up trading it for another 63 Chevrolet. He traded with Larry Mower and Gerald Reeder, and they had a 63 Biscayne two-door post that had a pretty potent combination in it. It was known as the Red Cloud. They traded cars. Larry and Gerald ended up with the New York Shaker car, and they repainted it red and named it Branded. Now there's very few pictures of this car in this configuration, but there are even fewer pictures of its later configurations because this car was then sold to Harry Huntsberry in Maryland, and it was repainted white and named So Rare. So Harry Huntsberry raced it for a little while, sold it to another guy in Ohio. The car was wrecked, and they actually had to put another roof on it. And the only other evidence of this car are these fuzzy pictures when it was sitting in a barn. You can see the different colored roof, you can see the white paint, you can barely make out some of that lettering on the side, and you can even see some of the Monaco blue paint around the taillight bezel and headlight bezel area. But by this point, it was a pretty rough car. There wasn't a whole lot there to speak of. And the really sad part about this is due to some sort of family conflict, the car ended up getting scrapped. So by the time this car had finished its whole run, it had been in North Carolina, Georgia, New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Ohio, and ultimately Iowa, where it went to the scrapyard and was never seen again. So the car we're looking at today, which was on display in the factory drag car exhibit at the Savoy Auto Museum in Cartersville, Georgia, this is a very faithful recreation built by Dennis Jackson a few years ago. It's not an actual Z11, but it does have very authentic Z11 parts. And that's going to give us an opportunity to talk about what makes a Z11 so special. And that is the aluminum body panels. So it's got aluminum fenders, it's got an aluminum hood, aluminum filler panel, and aluminum front and rear bumpers. So these cars were also ordered with no front sway bar. They were ordered with a very special 427 cubic inch engine, which was based on the already popular 409. So this looks like a 409, but it's actually 427 thanks to a 3.65 inch stroke on the crankshaft. So these things had 13.5:1 compression. They had very special cylinder heads. They had a two-piece intake manifold with two 4-barrel carburetors, and then that air cleaner pulls fresh air out of the cowl panel right down into the engine. But you'll notice that a lot of these cars ended up with custom hood scoops, so it's likely that a lot of these very special and very rare air cleaners ended up in the scrap pile back in the 1960s. These cars were rated at 430 horsepower, but we got to remember that the factories were being pretty modest about their horsepower ratings because most of the class designations were separated by advertised horsepower and the weight of the car. So realistically, these things probably made close to 500 horsepower in original form, but if they were blueprinted and gone through by somebody like Dino Don or Bill Jenkins, somebody like that could put these things way over 500 horsepower with just some little tricks. And they called it blueprinting, but you know, there were little tricks that you could do to the inside of these engines that would really free up a lot of horsepower. Behind the 427 is a T10 4-speed, and these cars also had very special brakes. These brakes came off of a Corvette Z06, which is a really rare car to begin with. But because of all this added horsepower, they put these bigger drum brakes on there, which required the use of 15-inch steel wheels instead of the factory 14s. Now there are conflicting reports of how many of these cars were actually produced. Some say 50, some say 57, but either way, it's an extremely rare car and there's just a handful of them that still exist. Legend status is achieved when you take a $200,000 fully restored Copo Camaro and turn it into an old school drag car. So I feel like I have a pretty good track record when it comes to researching old cars, finding old pictures, especially of old drag cars. That's really my area of focus. But the owner of this car, Jim Lammers, has me beat by a mile. He went above and beyond to research the ownership history of this car, which led him to all of these great discoveries that I'm going to tell you about in this video. Now, the one owner that he hasn't been able to track down, no matter how hard he's tried, is the original owner. There is no trace of who owned this car originally because it was only owned by that individual for just a few months. He ended up selling Doug that car. Doug took it home and immediately started making a drag car out of it. Now, Doug had raced some cars before. He had an L79 Nova, he had a Mopar that he raced, and this was just the next in line. This was a basically brand new car at this point, and they took it and stripped the car down and repainted it. You can see in some of the pictures it looks like it's sitting pretty high in the front. It looks like maybe they had the engine out of it, probably sent it to Alton James to have it worked over and given the superstock treatment, because rules were really specific in superstock about engine modifications. So they had to do some pretty secret stuff on the inside of the engine to make it legal for the class and, make the kind of horsepower they were wanting. So this thing absolutely went through a transformation, and it was essentially a brand new car. But you can still see some of the Le Mans blue still existed on it. They just put a big white panel and a red panel, and then later they came back and put lettering on there, and the car was called the Rat's Nest. So this car raced for several years, raced at tracks like Killcare in Ohio, and raced at the U.S. Nationals in Indy for a couple of years. So this car got around quite a bit, but it wasn't what you'd consider a nationally touring car. So there's not a tremendous amount of pictures of it at big national events. Luckily though, Jim was able to track down several of these pictures through Doug Davis's family. Doug unfortunately had passed away, but his wife Judy and his son Denny were able to put together quite a few pictures of this car to help tell its story and to help understand the full history of this thing as a drag car. Because Doug was fully responsible, along with Rick Wilkin, for putting this thing on the drag strip and, putting it into this Rat's Nest identity. So after Doug raced the car for a few years, he ended up selling it to a guy named Daniel Nicely. He sold it to Terry Wally, who then sold it to Ralph Willis, who then sold it to John Taylor, who then sold it to DJ Justice. So this thing went from place to place, town to town, owner to owner, and somehow never racked up a whole lot of miles. And even to this day, this car just has about 15,000 miles on it, which is just unbelievable. So through the years, the different owners kind of changed the identity of this car. You can see when Terry Wally owned it, this was kind of like mid-70s. The graphics were off of it, but the color scheme was still there. He had changed the wheels a little bit, it had Keystone mags on it instead of the slots, and it was just a street machine at this point. So this car's biggest change happened in about 1978, and that's when Ralph Willis painted the car. He got rid of the red, white, and blue, painted it black with gold stripes, and you can also see that it's not really a drag car or street machine anymore. It's more of a restored look because it's got rallies on it, it's got raised white letter tires. It's not a real aggressive setup like what it had. So, this car stayed in this configuration for many years, all the way through John Taylor's ownership in 1980 through about 82, and then all the way through DJ Justice's ownership, which started in 82 and ended in 2018 when Jim bought the car. And there was no real evidence, no immediate signs that it was a Copo. And there was no signs that it was a drag car. When Jim started running some of the numbers and started really researching what it took to be a Copo Camaro, he started getting a little more excited about this car because he was seeing that this could be a Copo. So when he had a few of those clues kind of put together, he got in touch with Jerry McNeish. Now Jerry is the Copo guy. He certifies Copos, around the world. He said that an X44 car, which is on the trim tag, that designates that it's pretty much a base model car, X44 with a big block heater box and a pierced hole in the firewall just above the fuse panel for the cowl induction wiring. That was the telltale sign that told McNeish that this was for sure a Copo car. But through all of this digging and through all of this paperwork and all of this research, Jim never could find the original owner. So after the confirmation that it was a Copo and all of the digging to find all the drag car stuff, it was time to restore this car. And Jim actually restored it all the way back to original. And even though the engine was gone and the rear end was gone and some of the other important parts and pieces were gone from the car, he tracked down original parts, original date-coded parts that went with the September build date of this car. He and his brother Mike put this thing together, and they did a spectacular job on the details. All of the numbers are correct for this car. Even though they're not the born with numbers, they are correct in terms of date codes and in terms of casting numbers, and all that kind of stuff is really, really fine-tuned on this car. It was a passion project to make this thing as right as possible. So when all of that happened, he put this car back together in its original form. Painted steel wheels, dog dish caps, Goodyear white leather tires, Le Mans blue paint, just a picture perfect restored Copo Camaro. And he took it to the Camaro Nationals in this configuration. And then he brought the car home and started on the drag car transformation. And one of the big goals in his mind was to do this in a reversible type of manner, so that if he decided to sell the car, or if he got tired of the drag car look, he could put it back to stock. And he did that pretty carefully using vinyl. So all the white and the red and obviously the lettering and decals, all that is vinyl, and it can be removed from this car. But I will tell you, I've seen a lot of vinyl on a lot of cars, and this one is pretty convincing. It has a really good gloss to it. It's very slick. It doesn't have that texture like you normally see on a vinyl decal. And this thing fooled me for sure. The first time I saw it, I did not realize those were decals. So the paint and the vinyl situation really changed the attitude of this car. And then he bought a set of slotted mag wheels, which they're Fenton front runners, 15 by 3.5s, Pro-Track front runner tires. The rears are M&H slicks on 15 by 8.5 inch slots. The stance is perfect, and you can see it's got some yellow traction bars on there. Well, those are the original traction bars that Doug Davis put on this car in about 1971. And the reason why we say 1971 is there's actually a date stamped on those traction bars. And this car also had a drive shaft loop that was bolted to the floor pan that was also around that same generation. And when Jim did this transformation, he also put in a Lakewood blow-proof bell housing. So this car's got the correct pieces. It's got hooker headers that have been coated in white, no exhaust whatsoever, just open headers. It's got all the right pieces that you would have in a drag car of this generation, a superstock car especially. You'll see some auxiliary gauges under the dash. Those are Sun blue lines. Those are authentic. It's got an authentic Hurst roll control line lock on there. It's got all the right pieces. The Cal Custom valve covers, the Fly Eye breather, it's all correct. It all matches up with that early 70s build time from when Doug Davis owned this car. So the biggest thing he changed as far as the body is concerned for this drag car transformation is he actually completely changed the deck lid altogether, because this car was ordered with no spoiler, but everything else as far as the body's concerned is stock, and that's how Doug had it back in the day. And then he added all of the proper lettering onto the windows. The Superstock D classifications, the car number, which was 1718, it's huge on those door glasses. Doug Davis, that's just like it was back in the day. And then on the quarter glass, he's got NHRA decals and smaller SSD designations. And then on the side of the car, he's got everything exactly like this car was, even down to the Alton James decal that's down on the front fender. He had that made to replicate what was lettered on the car originally. So this thing is absolutely to the letter to what Doug Davis had back in the early 70s. And you can even see some of the details. These bumpers, you'll see that the bumpers aren't actually perfect. Those are original bumpers. Those are original chrome from 1969, which is amazing. And then Jim actually had that Ray Bryant decal. He had that made based off of an ad he saw in a newspaper from 1969 from that dealership. An incredible amount of detail went into making this car as correct as possible, both on the original side of things and on the superstock side of things. So, just an outstanding car altogether. One of the most special parts about this car's history is the fact that Jim took the time to not only reach out to these previous owners, but to actually bring the car to them to see it. And he did this before he restored it and after he restored it. So they got the chance to kind of catch up on this car and talk about it and think about it and, really get these memories flowing on this car. And when Jim took this car for the Davis family to see it, it got really interesting because they showed him a lot of great pictures. And one in particular that's really cool to me is this ratty looking picture. You can see it's up on a ramp truck with a matching paint job. It might be going through a parade or something. You see some people waving. But anyways, this picture was actually in Doug Davis's wallet for many, many years. And when Doug passed away several years ago, it transferred over into his son Denny's wallet, where it still rides to this day. So while they're going through the pictures and history on this car, Jim sees a pencil outline drawing of the Rat's Nest car, and he asked what the deal was with that. So Denny told him that was actually the artwork that was used to make Doug's gravestone. So they went and visited Doug's gravesite, and right there is an amazing piece of this car's history. Engraved in stone is the Rat's Nest Camaro. And I mean, that seals the deal, in my opinion, as far as the significance of this car for the Davis family. The Rat's Nest Camaro was obviously a big part of Doug Davis's life, and now it just makes this car's story even more special. With the 1964 Ford Fairlane that everybody calls the Thunderbolt. Now this package was extreme for Ford. It was definitely the most outrageous combination they'd ever put together because they took their mid-size platform, the Ford Fairlane, which was a unibody car, and they put their biggest engine in it. And to accomplish this, they actually sent these cars out to Dearborn Steel Tubing Company to have this conversion completed. So they had to modify the shock towers, they had to build new exhaust manifold headers basically. They had to do a lot of special stuff to make that 427 fit into the smaller platform. This was a special race-prepared engine. It had a high-rise intake manifold, it had two 4-barrel carburetors on it, and a very special cast aluminum air cleaner that had these big dryer vent looking tubes that went to the inboard headlights. But underneath all of that is a very potent engine. Very special components in addition to that 427 are the fiberglass front fenders, the fiberglass hood that has a teardrop scoop, and it had to have a scoop because the intake carburetor and air cleaner combination was much taller than stock and it would not clear a stock hood. So the teardrop scoop kind of gave these cars a special identity. And then there was a lot of other lightweight components, the bumpers, and some cars had a combination of aluminum and steel. Some cars had fiberglass. It was just a matter of where they landed on that production cycle and what Dearborn Steel Tubing Company used to put the car together, because basically every one of them was a little bit different. Dearborn Steel Tubing Company built 100 examples of the Thunderbolt car. They built 51 automatics and 49 four-speed cars. And these cars obviously are very expensive today. They're very valuable because they're so rare, and a lot of them got tore up in the drag racing days. So definitely less than 100 of these cars exist. And this particular one belongs to Steve Honnell, and he's based out of Middle Tennessee. He raced this car in Alabama. Because superstock racing was at such a crazy pace during this time, Steve actually ended up selling this car when he got his hands on a factory-produced Mercury Comet drag car, which we'll look at in a minute. But he sold this car and basically lost track of it. And then it resurfaced many, many years later in Floyd Garrett's Muscle Car Museum in Sevierville, Tennessee. The car was completely restored, and it ended up in Reggie Jackson's collection for a short time. Steve then confirmed that Reggie Jackson's car was in fact his old race car, and he made a deal to buy the car back. So this car went back to its original owner, and that's an extremely rare situation for any factory-produced drag car, but especially rare with these Ford Thunderbolts. These cars were ordered completely stripped down, no accessories whatsoever. The factory glass was removed and replaced with plexiglass, and then of course the seats were removed and replaced with very small bucket seats. So, you know, basically these cars were as stripped down as you could be with the biggest engine you could have. So 3,200 pounds, 425 horsepower rating, and these cars were absolutely the top dogs on the drag strip. In fact, the very first race of the year, the NHRA Winter Nationals, there was 2 Thunderbolts in the finals. Now, it wasn't this Thunderbolt, but still, these cars were potent, they were fast, they looked cool, and they're iconic pieces of Ford racing history. Sticking with the Ford camp, we're going to a 1964 Ford Galaxie 500 lightweight. Now, it is unusual that Ford would produce 2 factory drag cars in the same year with completely different platforms. So the Ford Thunderbolt was based on that Fairlane, which was a mid-size car with the big engine, and they had to do a lot of modifications just to make it all work. But the Galaxy was a known combination that had already been very potent in the 1963 season, so the 64 was kind of a continuation of that, but the real purpose behind the Galaxy was a Plan B. So the idea of the Thunderbolt was revolutionary, and Ford was a little bit concerned that they might get to the first race of the year and get completely disqualified and run off from the drag strip. So they built these Galaxies as a backup plan. If the Thunderbolt got ran off from the drag strip, they'd have a factory-backed option. So the 64 Galaxy lightweight had the same engine combination. This was an R code 427, 425 horsepower. It had the high-rise intake manifold. It had the two 4-barrel carburetors. It had a cast aluminum air cleaner, just like the Thunderbolt. Except some of these Galaxies, like this one, had a special air cleaner with molded ducts instead of the wire duct like what you'd see on all the Thunderbolts. So this is a really rare combination. Just a handful of them exist. You'll also notice this car has an aluminum radiator in it, which typically is a red flag for an old restoration like this, that somebody has gone in and added some modern aftermarket pieces. But the reality is that you could get an aluminum radiator for these Ford lightweight cars. They're extremely rare, they're extremely hard to find, but given the fact that this car is owned by Larry Davis, who is a drag racing historian, a superstock expert, a factory drag car expert, I doubt he would put some kind of cheesy aftermarket piece on this car, because this car is largely original. It has been mechanically restored to be functional, but for the most part, this car has a lot of original pieces on it. So we'll see that the paint job, it's got some age on it. You can see the cracking of the paint. The lettering has got a little bit of age on it. But you'll also see that this car ran without this lettering on it back in the day. There's not very many pictures of it, but this car ran in the Ohio area, and it competed in 1966, 67, and 68 at the U.S. Nationals. So this car's got some pretty neat history. It's very well preserved. It's not over-restored in any way. And this car's obviously very valuable because only 50 of these cars were made. 25 4-speed cars, which this one is a 4-speed, and 25 automatic cars. Even though these cars are called a lightweight, they don't have the extensive lightweight parts that, like the 63.5 Ford Galaxy or the Thunderbolt, they don't have all of those pieces. Basically, the only lightweight component is the fiberglass hood, which it has the same teardrop scoop as the Thunderbolt. It has a cool look to it, but the main point here is saving a little bit of weight on the front of the car. And also part of that lightweight package is they move the battery to the trunk for better weight balance. And then, of course, these cars were ordered completely stripped down. They didn't have any kind of sound deadener, seam sealer. They didn't have any kind of accessories like a heater or a radio or even a clock. They were very stripped down cars, and they were all ordered with white paint, red interior. You'll see they've got lightweight bucket seats, no console or anything like that. These are just stripped down cars, basically as simple as you could make it to put the weight where it needed to be. So even though these cars still weighed 3,700 plus pounds, they were much lighter than they would have been if they were a fully optioned out Galaxy 500. You'll notice on the grille that some of the teeth have been removed to allow better airflow into those big air ducts. And then there's some other special things about these lightweight cars. They had an aluminum bell housing, and out back these cars had a 471 gear if they were equipped with an automatic transmission, or in this case they had a 457 rear gear ratio with the 4-speed transmission. So these things were race ready, they were tuned, they were ready to hit the quarter mile. And then this is a pretty nice touch here. This window sticker for this car is pretty substantial. So you'll see Galaxy 500 two-door hardtop, Wimbledon white, 4-speed transmission, dragster conversion package with 4-speed transmission. That was a pretty expensive deal. 427, 8V, that means 2 4s, high performance. And look at this, sold to Ford Motor Company, General Office, shipped to Holman and Moody in Charlotte, North Carolina. Now this is amazing right here. These cars have so much history because they had so many great people touching them. Holman and Moody obviously is legendary in the Ford camp, and to have one of these cars that Holman and Moody put their hands on is a pretty big deal. So you can see this car is pretty much unrestored. It does have some late model pieces on it, like the tires and wheels are not exactly appropriate for it, but they have the vintage look. But overall, this car is very authentic. This is another really great piece of Ford racing history. So there are some notable years in the factory drag car landscape. 1963 was a peak for General Motors, and then I guess some could say 1964 was a peak for Ford because of the Thunderbolt, but Ford continued to build factory drag cars well into the late 60s. Mercury built 60 of these 427 Comets, and they did it with 4 different body styles. They had the 202, which was the base model 2-door post, the Capri, the Caliente, and then the top line, which was the Cyclone. So 60 cars between those 4 different models. Just a handful of these things still exist. This Mercury Comet Cyclone is another piece of the Steve Honnell legacy, and this car's got some pretty serious racing history, and you can see on the outside here, this car has been reworked. It has some late model components. It's got sort of like some weld wheel, copy wheels on there. It's got modern tires on it. You can see that the lettering isn't exactly old school, but this thing's got the history. It's documented. It is the real deal. They were available with 2 different 427s. They had the R code, which is what this car has, 2 4s, 425 horse, and they were also available with the W code, which was a single 4-barrel, 410 horsepower. It's got a 4-speed transmission in it. You can see when we look in the interior, there's an old newspaper here that's got a picture of the car. Of course, it's got steel wheels on it, just like most of them did back in the day. And it's got a nice little blurb about this particular car and how they're gunning for a world championship. And you'll also see a Phoenix Dragway jacket in the back of this thing. This car's got a lot of good pieces on it, and the fact that this thing is still in the hands of its original owner, that's a big deal. All right, it's time to get into the Mopars because Dodge and Plymouth had a very special part in the factory drag car wars of the early to mid 1960s. And even into the late 60s, they continued to produce very special, high horsepower, lightweight cars, and we're going to touch on 2 of the most significant packages right here. So the first we're going to look at is a 1965 Plymouth Belvedere, and this is the A990 package. That means that this was a mid-size sedan, the Belvedere sedan. It had a 426 cubic inch Hemi. These things are extremely valuable, extremely rare. 101 of these Plymouth Belvederes were built, and a similar amount of Dodge Coronets were built in the same year. A big part of the A990 package was the inclusion of the 426 cubic inch Hemi engine, which was not yet available to the public. This engine had already proven its worth in 1964, and the improvements in 1965 included aluminum cylinder heads, a magnesium cross-ram intake manifold, and this thing cranked out an advertised 425 horsepower. But we all know that they made a lot more horsepower than that, especially when they were blueprinted by famous engine builders and car guys of that generation. These things cranked out probably closer to 600 horsepower if we're being honest. So these things were very potent. They had a lot of potential outside of what the factory put together, and that's what made them so famous in superstock racing. You'll notice this car has a very plain appearance. It has steel wheels on it. You'll notice black steel wheels and slicks on the back, but steel wheels, no hubcaps, a very plain color, very plain everything on these cars. The interior, pretty much as bare bones as you can get. Those little bitty seats came out of a van, very lightweight, very small. There's not a lot of accessories here, no back seat whatsoever, no radio, no heater, just a bare bones factory race car. This car does have some vintage racing belts in it, but you'll see that it doesn't have a wild paint job or crazy lettering or any kind of identification. This car is very much like it would have arrived at a racer's shop right before they went to the track. You can see they've put some slicks on it. It's got toe tabs on the front end, but the rest of this car is just like it would have left the factory. This car is part of the Steve Atwell collection. Now, Steve is a huge Mopar collector. He's got a lot of very significant Dodge and Plymouth cars in his collection. This is one of them. It's one of 101 built in this configuration, and these cars were highly, highly potent on the drag strip, and they stayed that way for many years. These cars, even after the superstock wars were over, these cars continued to be very competitive. You know, you'd see these cars with big tires under the back of them, but they'd still have that basic combination. This car really set the standard for Mopar drag racers from the 60s all beyond, you know, into the modern era of drag racing, because these had just a bulletproof combination that really, really worked. The 68 Hemi Dart. Now, this car had a code name like most of these things. LO23 designated a Hemi engine in a Dodge Dart. Even though things were changing very quickly, Chrysler stayed with the 426 cubic inch Hemi as it was a bulletproof combination that proved to be very successful on the drag strip. Still had big compression, still had great heads, cross ram intake manifold, but they're no longer magnesium at this point. They've been transitioned into aluminum, 2 Holley 4-barrel carburetors. These things made tremendous horsepower, and by this point, the engine builders of the day had really figured this thing out and were cranking out even more horsepower than those original A990 Hemis from '65. These Hemi Darts were available with 2 transmission options, a 4-speed manual and a 3-speed automatic. The 4-speed was then equipped with a Dana 60 rear end with 488 gears. The automatic transmission cars had an 8 3/4 rear end with 486 gears. Even though these cars were made by Dodge, they were actually put together by Hurst Performance in Madison Heights, Michigan. They did all the finish work to make these cars race ready. They replaced the steel fenders and hood with fiberglass components. The doors were acid dipped. They had different windows. They didn't actually have regulators in them. They just had a strap that you pulled up and fastened. And it got these cars down to about 3,000 pounds. Now, Plymouth had a similar combination in their Barracuda. These cars were based off of that same A-body platform. The Darts and the Barracudas were very similar in performance and very similar in rarity. So only 80 of these cars were produced. This car is part of the McCandless collection from Burlington, North Carolina. Now, Herb McCandless is one of the most legendary Mopar drag racers of all time. Mr. 4-Speed was his nickname, and he got that because he could really shift those gears. He was a race-winning driver, and he had really good equipment underneath him, and this Dart is a good example of that. Herb had an incredible season in this car in 1968. He raced 52 times with this car and won 36 of those races, placed second plenty of other times as well. So this car was a contender everywhere he went, and he raced mostly in the Southern match race style races or the heads-up classes that were really starting to come about. This is pre-pro stock, but it's very much a predecessor to that pro stock class because these super stock cars, especially these 68 Darts, had some special modifications, including those radius wheel wells on the back, which allowed the use of 10-inch wide tires, which was kind of a new thing for super stock. And of course, it's got Keystone wheels. The M&H tires on the back, those are real deal 1015s from back in the day. He ran this car for 2 seasons, 1968 and 1969, and won a bunch of races and won a bunch of money with it. I mean, he paid for this car with his earnings at the track, and that obviously catapulted him into some pretty big jobs. Now, previously, going all the way back to 65 and 6, he was running some pretty high dollar cars. He was factory backed. He partnered up with John Livingston on an altered wheelbase car. You know, he had some big opportunities, but his biggest opportunity came in 1970 when he took a job with Sox and Martin as a team driver, and he never looked back. Herb is definitely a Mopar racing legend, and this 68 Dart is one of the cars that got him there. One of the coolest parts about this car is the paint job. So it's got a really cool psychedelic stripe job on it, cool color combinations. I mean, this thing's got the perfect late 60s look, and that was actually done by Eddie Wilbanks in 1969. And when this car was restored in 2007 by Randy Hopkins, Eddie Wilbanks is the one who painted it again. So the original painter for the car painted it once again, and that just really ties the history of this thing all together. And this is an excellent tribute to the Grumpy's Toy Nova that ran back in the 1960s in NHRA stock eliminator. You'll see this car has all of the original markings. It's got the red and white paint job. It's got the door lettering with Bill Jenkins 1965 NHRA Winter National Mr. Stock Eliminator. You'll also see NHRA National Record Holder. This was a very potent car for back in the day. This was a lightweight car. It had Chevrolet's hottest small block. It had a L79, which was a 327 cubic inch, 350 horse, and Bill Jenkins could squeeze way more horsepower out of it than that advertised 350 horsepower. So these things were making well over 400 horsepower on a 7-inch wide slick, and I love the steel wheels, no caps or anything. Nothing fancy as far as the tires and wheels are concerned, but on this particular car, if you look underneath, you'll notice that it's got pie crust slicks. They've got these cool checkered flag tread. Now, that's not what they would have run back in the day, but it's a super cool detail on this car. Inside is completely stock. Because of the rules in NHRA Stock Eliminator, they couldn't run racing seats or any kind of real crazy looking interiors. They couldn't gut the interior out. So this is a bone stock interior. It's got a bench seat, it's got a 4-speed shifter sticking up out of the floor, no console, nothing fancy here other than a tack mounted on the dash. That's the only aftermarket accessory on this car. Under the hood is super plain and simple. You'll see 327, it's got those chrome valve covers, it's got an aluminum intake manifold, a Holley carburetor, and a little velocity stack, and that's it. There's not a whole lot going on here. Factory type ignition, it's got headers on it, but other than that, these cars couldn't be modified much further from this. Even though I'm sure this thing is not 100% correct to that Bill Jenkins Nova from back in the 60s, this thing is super cool. It's got the right look, it's got that L79 under the hood, and it's got some cool little slicks tucked under the back. This is a pretty neat piece. Even if you don't love all the stickers and all the markings on this car, it's got a cool look that represents those stock Eliminator cars from back in the mid-60s. When it comes to factory drag cars, it doesn't get much more rare than this 1969 Oldsmobile Cutlass S convertible with the W31 package. And these things were rare to begin with, but the car we're talking about today is even more rare because it's one of only 5 Oldsmobiles put together by their special engineering department specifically to go drag racing in NHRA stock Eliminator in 1969. Now this was a unique proposition. It was sort of a backdoor way of building some special cars under the guise of a TV sponsorship. So 5 cars were produced showcasing various combinations of Oldsmobile bodies, engines, and transmissions. All 5 of the cars would race in different classes, and the one we're going to pick up on today is the only remaining car out of those 5 that was built. It's the only one known to exist, that is. And this one is a W31 car, which makes this a little more unusual because it's already starting with a very rare platform. It's one of only 26 built, and then when you consider that it's one of the 5 Smothers Brothers cars, this is an unheard of, super rare, extremely valuable factory drag car. So before we get into the details of these 1969 cars, let's talk a little bit about the Smothers Brothers. Now this is 2 brothers, Tom and Dickie Smothers. These guys were a comedy duo in the 1960s. They had a TV show, it ran for a few years, they were pretty well-known guys, and Dickie was known in the car community because he liked racing. He liked going fast, he had a thing for road racing, but he also got involved in drag racing in 1968. And this was due to a partnership with Oldsmobile. And this really is what kicked off this 5-car team, but it started a little smaller than that in 1968 because Dickie had them build 2 cars. And oddly enough, his TV contract prohibited him from racing professionally, but he was able to go make exhibition passes at various races, including the 1968 U.S. Nationals. This picture shows some great hand lettering on the back of this early car. It says, "Created by Doc Watson, the action team, Dimmer Engineering." Now a little bit of insight here. Doc Watson was the creator of the Hurst Olds in 1968. And these pictures of the early car show many other sponsorships, including Schieffer Clutches, Edelbrock, Goodyear, Krager Wheels, Lakewood, Valvoline Oil, and others, which made this Smothers Brothers program a real powerhouse when it came to marketing these companies as well as Oldsmobile. I should also mention that the Smothers Brothers didn't just dabble in Oldsmobiles. They actually sponsored 2 dragsters. They sponsored Don Garlits, Big Daddy himself, as well as Dwight Salisbury in the Smothers Brothers Beach Boys Special. But the real focus for the Smothers Brothers, and specifically Dickie Smothers, was this Oldsmobile program. His 1968 Oldsmobiles had been rebodied into 1969s and then brand new cars for the 5-car team. The 2 Smothers Brothers Oldsmobiles ended up on the cover of Popular Hot Rodding magazine, as well as plenty of other media coverage throughout the end of 1968 into the 1969 season. Meanwhile, back in Detroit, a plan was brewing for a 5-car racing team, and this would be a hand-picked group of racers through a hand-picked group of dealerships all across the country in a way that they couldn't do officially because remember, General Motors pulled out of racing altogether in 1963, so therefore there were no official drag cars or factory drag cars that were built under any of the General Motors brands. So the fact that these Oldsmobile employees were able to pull off this deal, which was under the guise of a TV sponsorship, was miraculous. They were able to show off Oldsmobile's horsepower and use some celebrity horsepower to get the word out there. So the guys responsible for putting this program together was Jim Williams, he's a PR guy for Oldsmobile, and Dale Smith, he was the motorsports manager for Oldsmobile. So these guys put their heads together, put together this program, presented it to the Smothers Brothers, and they put this thing all together. It was a very elaborate program. They chose 5 specific dealerships, and they specially prepared 5 cars for NHRA stock eliminator competition. The 5 cars in the Smothers Brothers racing team are as follows. There was the Dewey Griffin Olds 442 out of Washington State. This was a W30 car with an automatic transmission. It was a convertible, and that put it into the F stock automatic category. Pete Coast handled the driving on this car. Then in California there was Century Olds, and that was driven by Willard Wright. Another convertible, this time a W31 automatic car, and this one ran in the G stock automatic class. Next is Chesrone Olds out of Ohio, with Ron Gary behind the wheel running in F stock with his F85 W31 combination with a 4-speed transmission. Then there was Lloyd Woodland, who represented Barajic Olds out of Massachusetts. He raced in the E stock category with a 442 W31 and a 4-speed combination. Last but not least, and the car we're going to be talking about specifically today, is the one sponsored by King Olds out of Florida. This car was driven by Jim Wable. He was a well-known drag racer, but he was not necessarily an Oldsmobile guy. He had previously raced a 57 Chevy, and he actually continued to race that 57 Chevy while he campaigned this Oldsmobile. His car was a W31 convertible, 4-speed, and that put him in the G stock category. And let's touch on the W31 package for just a second. It's an extremely rare package. Only 913 of them were produced in 1969. And the W31 was a 350 cubic inch, 325 horsepower combination. They were kind of fudging those numbers so that the NHRA didn't catch on and put them in a different class. So the W31 package was rated at 325 horsepower, but that rating came at only 5,400 RPMs. And these engines, because they had big valves, a big cam, a big quadrajet carburetor, these things revved to over 6,500 RPMs. You can see those oval-shaped inlets under the bumper that let fresh air directly into the engine. And with blueprinting and some other little tricks, these things could make well over 400 horsepower. And then once these 5 Smothers Brothers cars went through the special engineering department, they breathed even better because they had headers on them. These things had some special equipment that would keep them within the NHRA stock eliminator rules, but would also give them an advantage over a production model. They were all equipped similarly. They all had Krager wheels. They all had the same type tires. They all had the same paint job. They had the same font on the graphics on the side. You can see the comparisons between these 5 cars. And the idea behind this 5-car team was to debut them at the NHRA Winter Nationals in 1969. The issue with that was that the cars weren't even built until the 3rd week of December. So when you consider the holidays and the travel schedules and the delivery schedules of these cars, these things didn't end up in the hands of the racers until January. And just a few weeks later, the Winter Nationals was taking place in Pomona, California. So any of the guys who wanted to pull the motor out and do any kind of blueprinting or any special tricks, they had a very short window of opportunity to do that. 4 of the 5 Smothers Brothers cars were in attendance at the Winter Nationals, and Jimmy Wable performed the best out of all of them. He actually made it to the finals in his class, and that would set the tone for the rest of the 1969 season, because part of the Smothers Brothers deal was that these 5 cars would attend all of NHRA's national events. So that would include Dallas, that would include the U.S. Nationals, some really big races and some great exposure for these racers, for the dealerships, and of course for Oldsmobile. So after the 5 cars were complete, there was still enough budget left in this program to send all 5 racers plenty of replacement parts because they would need them. They were really leaning on these cars, and they were out there breaking records, they were out there winning races. These cars performed very well, and they got extra engines, they got extra cylinder heads, camshafts, transmissions, rear ends, anything that they wanted that was Oldsmobile related, they could get their hands on it. and they were out there really making some big moves in stock eliminator. Jimmy Wable in the King Olds ended up winning G stock at the NHRA Spring Nationals in Dallas and continued to have great success throughout the season. In this listing, you'll see several of the Smothers Brothers team drivers, including Jimmy Wable, listed here in G stock, running a 1266 at 110.56 miles per hour. Another special experience for this car was the ribbon cutting ceremony at Gainesville Dragway, now known as Gainesville Raceway. This drag strip opened in 1969 and held the first Gator Nationals in 1970, but this car was on hand for the ribbon cutting ceremony. You can see it here with the top down. This is the only known pictures of this car with the top down. One with people driving on the return road and one right there on the starting line for the ribbon cutting. The Smothers Brothers cars also got used in Valvoline ads. So this full-page Valvoline ad had all 5 of the Smothers Brothers Oldsmobiles as well as the 2 Smothers Brothers dragsters. So these cars were getting tremendous exposure all year long. If you're enjoying this video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button and subscribe if you haven't already. So the agreement between Lewis King and Jimmy Wable was that this car would be returned on January 15th, 1970. What I found was that this car was actually kept a little bit longer, probably due to car availability for the 1970 season, because Jimmy actually raced this car at the NHRA Winter Nationals in Pomona in 1970. He also raced it at the Gator Nationals, the first annual Gator Nationals at Gainesville Dragway. So there's very limited pictures of this 1970 configuration, but a telltale sign is that this car is designated as H stock instead of G stock. So that was after NHRA had redone its rules package. This car fell into the H stock category. So we see a few examples of it here. The only example I have from the Gator Nationals is this staging lane shot where you can see 2 of the Smothers Brothers cars parked in the staging lanes, the first of which is the King Olds. So we don't have any official documentation of when he actually turned that car in, but it wasn't long after his agreed upon January date because he ended up with a 1970 Oldsmobile shortly thereafter. So the 1970 Oldsmobile had a different paint job. It did have the King Olds on the door, similar to that 1969 combination. And even though these pictures aren't the best quality, you can see on the back of the car it says Smothers Brothers Racing Team. So even though it wasn't quite as elaborate as that 1969 combination, it was still a sponsored vehicle and it still carried that Smothers Brothers name, although it did not carry it for the full 1970 season. And that's because the Smothers Brothers TV show got canceled, so the sponsorship also fizzled out, and the only one that carried it through 1971 was the car from Barajic Oldsmobile. So as the 1970 drag racing season carried on, a lot of these drag racers just turned those cars back into the dealerships, and in a lot of cases the dealerships may have just resold the car. And that's exactly what happened with Jimmy Wable's example, because he sent it back to King Olds and they actually sanded this thing off and sprayed it with a bright yellow color, and it would have been really hard to trace that history back. But there was a trademark detail on this car that set it apart from all the others. And it just so happens that one of Jimmy's friends that helped him weld together those big traction bars on his car saw this car sitting on the used car lot several years later, and he noticed those traction bars way up under there, big heavy duty bars, and he stopped and looked at the car, confirmed that that was the same one that he welded up years ago, and he got in touch with Jimmy Wable and told him that your old car is for sale at this used car lot. So Jimmy ended up buying the car and he stashed it away. Of course, it's yellow, it's just got street wheels on it, it's not a drag car anymore, but he always wanted to put it back to the way it was raced in 1969. Jimmy shared many stories of this car with his son Jeremy, who carried on that Wable legacy, and he continued racing and continued winning, continued building engines and preparing lots of cars through the years. Jeremy's still out there doing it to this day, and there was always this hope that Jimmy and Jeremy could put their heads together and get this car back on the track someday, or at least get it back to its 1969 configuration. Like many personal projects, This one sat in the corner of the shop and collected dust for lots and lots of years. And there was always an assumption that Jimmy had been offered lots of money for this car, or people had been trying to buy it from him for years, but the reality was that he just hadn't found the right buyer yet. And that's where Jeff Kane comes into the picture. Now, he's not from Florida, he's not an Oldsmobile guy, he's just a drag racer that loves historic cars. And he was actually looking for a 57 Chevy fuel injection unit when he ran across Jeremy Wable. And Jeremy let him know that his dad had a 57 fuel injection unit that he might sell, and that conversation carried along for a little while, and it led to Jeff getting on an airplane and just flying down to Florida and checking the place out. So while he's there, he sees the King Olds, and he doesn't know it, he doesn't recognize the car, he doesn't even realize that this is one of the 5 Smothers Brothers cars. It's just a bright yellow Oldsmobile convertible that's stuffed in the corner of the shop. But he asked about it, and the Wables let him know that this was a significant car and it meant a lot to their family. So when asked if they wanted to sell this car, the response was only to the right person. And the conversation carried on, and actually Jimmy's wife Margaret asked Jeff, if we sold you this car, what would you do with it? And there's a couple different options here. You know, you could put this car back to a showroom ready 1969 W31 convertible, which is one of 26 and very rare, very valuable car. Or you could put it back to the one of 5 Smothers Brothers cars. And his answer was that he would put it back into the 1969 race-ready configuration with King Olds on the door, Jimmy Wable's name on the fender, and just like it was raced in the 1969 season. And that obviously triggered something with the Wable family because they started talking. Jeff put an offer together for the King Olds plus that 57 fuel injection unit plus another intake and carburetor setup that he spotted, and they took the deal. They took his offer, and Jeff was able to get this highly significant, very rare, and very cool Oldsmobile, brought it home, and immediately started researching and gathering parts and getting an understanding of what it was going to take to put this car back to its original as-raced condition. And for that, he trusted Garner Customs and Restorations in Florida, and they did a tremendous job putting this car back together as it should have been. So everything on this thing is authentic and correct. And one of the most special moments that happened during this car's restoration was that Dickie Smothers came to Garner's shop to check this car out and verify it was one of his cars, and of course just reminisce over those good old days of drag racing. And he even wore his old Smothers Brothers racing team jacket and posed with the car just like he did back in 1969. So that was a really special part of this restoration, a really neat tie-in with the history of this car, and just some priceless pictures that go in a huge album of reference photos from back in the day. Jeff and his wife Brenda were able to debut the car at the 2021 McCacken Show in Chicago, and then they hauled it down to the Gator Nationals in 2022, where this car was supposed to be on display and part of a special ceremony, but the event got completely washed out and they couldn't actually get it out and put it on display. But while it was there, they were able to show the Wable family this car for the first time since completion, and it was an emotional moment for all of them because this car meant so much to them, and it was such a joy to see this car the way that it was in 1969 and bring back all those great memories that Jimmy and Margaret had made, and just for Jeremy to see this car too, because he really trusted Jeff to take this car and do the right thing with it, and he did. He did everything that you could do to do this car justice and to pay tribute to Jimmy Wable and the whole Wable family and the whole Smothers Brothers racing team. I mean, this car is the only known representative of that 5-car team, and it's doing it all justice. I mean, it's bringing awareness to that team, and obviously it's paying tribute to some really special people along the way. One of the coolest displays in the pits is the junior stock class. Now these guys got together, they all park together, they all run together, and these cars are really cool. Most of them are station wagons or sedan deliveries, which was very popular back in the 60s because that put them in a lower class, something like N stock or M stock or O stock, because these things had small cubic inch engines, smaller horsepower, big weight, and this was highly competitive. These four-door cars, these station wagons, they were all running up against each other back in the 60s, and NHRA called it junior stock. That meant anything that wasn't A stock or super stock. So these classes were full of variety, tons of cool cars, and a lot of these cars on display have major history. And not only are they on display, but they actually go out and race these things. They're out there running exactly what they would have run back in the day. The McMaster and Gunning 1957 Chevrolet Junior Stalker. This car was a record holder, a race winner, a points champion. It did all the things in the late 60s and was retired at the end of the 1971 season. This car spent 42 years in dry storage before being pulled out, cleaned up, and put back on the track. So let's take it back to the beginning. We got two car guys who happen to be brothers, Jack and Ken Gunning. They're from Pennsylvania, and they have built a 1957 Chevrolet four-door station wagon which runs in the junior stock eliminator. And this car was very successful. It was an NHRA national record holder. They campaigned this car locally at Vargo Dragway. They campaigned it all over the Northeast in NHRA Division 1. Since both of these brothers were pretty talented craftsmen, they went all out to make this car look good and perform good. So underneath, this thing was completely painted white. On the top side, light green, and you can see the 210 trim is intact, but they have eliminated some of the front end trim on this car to give it a more clean look, and even removing the bullets on the front of the hood. That was also an aerodynamic trick that helped air flow right over the top of that hood instead of getting disrupted by those little bullets. Ken also pieced together a really cool custom grille using 3 1963 Impala grill sections. This car had tasteful hand lettering, had tons of cool decals all over the windows and on the quarter panels, and they hauled it around on a big Chevrolet truck, a big flatbed truck that they had painted to match, and it said Gunning Brothers, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. You'll notice through the years that they changed wheel and tire combinations on this car. They went from black steel wheels and white walls to white steel wheels and eventually to Krager SS wheels. So around 1965, Jack and Ken spotted a car in a local junkyard. It was a 1957 Chevrolet 210 four-door hardtop. So they suggested to their good friend Alan McMaster that this might be a good candidate for an up-and-coming race car, and he jumped at the chance to go ahead and buy it. He paid $75 for it and went in partners with a guy named Courtney Nelson to begin the build on this car. Big Al and Court built this car with some leftover parts from the Jolly Green Giant station wagon, and Ken also jumped in there to help get this thing straightened up and painted. They put Roman red paint on it and added a center stripe just like what was on the station wagon, and then lettered Grin and Barrett on the front fender. Much like the station wagon build, this one started out with steel wheels and then later transitioned into Krager SS wheels. With a shipping weight of 3,316 pounds and a 220 horsepower 283 engine, this car was classified in the M stock category. That still put it in the junior stock eliminator, very highly contested class in NHRA in the late 60s. And to give you a little bit of background on the NHRA junior stock eliminator, it was essentially the lower level stock classes. So super stock and A stock ran in their own division called top stock eliminator. The rest of the classes, B stock on down all the way through the alphabet, ran in junior stock eliminator. The Grin and Barrett 57 Chevy was on the track by 1966, and by 1967 a Jenkins competition engine was purchased and put into the car. Midway through the 1968 season, the Gunning brothers sold the Jolly Green Giant station wagon, and at the time Ken was actually leading the Division I stock eliminator points. And since the points were awarded to the driver and not the car, Big Al and Court offered Ken the opportunity to drive the Grin and Barrett car at the remaining 1968 points meets. Ken performed very well behind the wheel of the car, and they were fortunate enough to win the 1968 Stock Eliminator Points Championship. At the end of the 1968 season, Big Al became the sole owner of the car. Jack and Ken stepped in to maintain the car, and then Ken continued to drive it. Between the 1968 and 1969 seasons, they took the opportunity to strip the car back down and give it a new appearance. They did some mild customizing. They got rid of the bullets on the hood, they got rid of some of the emblems on the back of it, and then they went back with a custom paint job which included 1969 Camaro colors: Le Mans blue, Dover white, and Hugger orange. Once again, Ken Gunning handled the paintwork on this car, and he made it a very slick looking piece for the 1969 season. Even though the stock eliminator classes had some pretty strict rules, you could still get away with some weight reduction because your car was classified on its shipping weight, not its actual weight on the day of the race. So as long as it fit within the rules, you could do these tricks like getting rid of the undercoating, painting it, doing everything you could to both help aerodynamics, weight, horsepower, anything you could do to fit within those rules and maybe bend the rules where you had the opportunity. And that subject brings us to the Jenkins competition engine that's under the hood of this car. Originally displacing 283 cubic inches, the bores were enlarged by 60 thousandths, which created a 292. It had a stock crank, stock rods, and forged true 9.5:1 compression pistons. They ran a 18 thousandths thick steel GM head gasket to gain a little bit more compression and still be legal. It had an NHRA legal competition valve job by Jenkins Competition, and it had a completely stock valve train otherwise. Inside the block is a General Kinetics No. 6 original cheater cam. Now they call these cheater cams because they weren't exactly stock specifications, but they were NHRA legal. On top of the original cast iron intake manifold was the original Chevrolet 4-barrel carburetor, which had some legal modifications done to it. An original Chevrolet dual-point distributor provided the spark with some help from an Excel coil, and then a set of Hooker fender well headers dumped right past the front wheels. And back then they were looking for every advantage they could get. Even just a fraction of a horsepower meant something to these stock eliminator cars. So this can that mounts in front of the radiator support, you would pour ice in there and put a little lid on it, and that would cool the fuel before it enters the car. Behind the Jenkins competition small block was a BorgWarner T10 4-speed. This thing had a 254 first gear, no internal modifications whatsoever, but it did have a Hurst Competition Plus shifter with reverse lockout. Before 1969, they were allowed to run a 4-speed manual transmission because you could order a 1957 Corvette with that transmission. Well, in 1969, that rule changed to where you had to run a factory-style transmission for the type of car you were driving. So they had to change to a 3-speed, and they made some modifications based on some advice from Grumpy Jenkins, but it still wasn't the same car. They didn't have the same performance. In 1971, they got away from the manual transmission altogether and changed the car over to a Powerglide 2-speed automatic transmission, just like what it would have come with from the factory. And Ken said that this was both slow and boring. Moving further back, the car's got its stock 57 Chevy rear end housing. It has heat-treated gears with a 538:1 ratio, and it has Chrysler splined Henry axles. As far as suspension tricks are concerned, it had Coney 90-10 shocks on the front, 50-50 shocks on the back, and a stall traction bar. The car rolled on a set of Krager SS wheels, 15x4s on the front, 15x6s on the back. It had Moroso Drag Special 760-15 front runner tires, and on the back it had M&H Race Masters. Now, stock Eliminator required a tire that measured no larger than 7 inches wide, and it also had to have 2 grooves of tread in it. Now, M&H made a special tire just for stock Eliminator, and it had those 2 required grooves. It measured right at 7 inches wide, and these things would hook up really great compared to the recap slicks or street tires or anything of that nature. Inside, a local upholstery shop redid all the interior in 1968, and all of that black vinyl is still there and it's still intact. This car had Stewart Warner gauges and a Stewart Warner tack, but there wasn't a whole lot else to this car. It didn't have a big roll cage, it didn't have big safety harnesses or anything like that. It had one seat belt for the driver, and that was pretty much it. These cars during this time were not necessarily quick or fast enough to require all those safety items. The NHRA would look at these class designations for the stock Eliminator category and adjust accordingly. So that's why you see, even though this car continued to run its same combination for several years, it was classified as an M stock, an N stock, and an O stock, all with the same setup. It was just based on NHRA's indexes for that given year. You know, NHRA continued to make changes in this class and ultimately made some big changes at the end of the 1971 season. So for the 1972 season, this junior stock Eliminator would have a completely different rules package, and it basically sent all of those previous junior stock cars into no man's land. They could either go race in modified production, or at this time bracket racing was starting to become a thing. So, you know, there was a future for some cars. However, the McMaster and Gunning car, it was done. At the end of the 1971 season, this car was parked. They didn't have a real plan for it, and unfortunately, Big Al, who was still owner of the car, he passed away, and he left the car to his family, and that was kind of the end of the drag racing days for the Gunning brothers. Fast forward to 2011, and the Gunning brothers are still interested in drag cars, especially in the history side of things now that, you know, they're looking back on their career and their life of running the roads and running these drag cars. And they were approached by a guy named Doug Boyce. He's an author of many books, and he was writing a book about junior stock cars, and he wanted to include information about the McMaster and Gunning car. It was an iconic piece of junior stock Eliminator history. And that encouraged Ken to reach out to the McMaster family and see if this car existed. He knew that the car had been parked in the family garage, but he didn't know what might have happened in the 40-plus years that had gone by. So he was able to reach out to Alan's 4 nieces and nephews who took ownership of this car. Ken and Jack went to go check this thing out and were just astonished to see that the car was almost exactly the same as they had last seen it in the early 70s. The only things missing were the tachometer and the rear wheels and tires. They worked out a deal with the McMaster family to revive this car, to pull it out of storage, to clean it up, to get it running again, to get some fresh tires and wheels on the back of it, and to actually put this thing back out into the public where it could be seen, where the stories could be told. And the family agreed to let them pull the car out. They didn't want to sell the car, but they did make an arrangement to where Ken and Jack could revitalize this car, get it back out into the nostalgia drag racing scene. The Gunning brothers didn't disrupt any of this car's historical value. They did have to replace a few brake items and just a couple of pieces here and there to make the car functional again, but they debuted this car at the 2013 Muscle Car Madness show in York, Pennsylvania, and it was the first time this car had moved under its own power in 42 years. A couple years later, they took the car to Bowling Green, Kentucky to the inaugural Danchuk Tri-5 Nationals, where it took home the Best Survivor Car award. And I've got to say that out of all the drag cars that I've featured, all the cars that I've researched through the years, this has got to be one of the most complete and most accurate Survivors I've ever seen. According to Ken's records, the best this car ever ran was in 1969, and it ran a 1340 at 102 miles per hour. That was good enough for the NHRA national record. And then fast forward to 2015, the modern era where this car continues to perform with its original Jenkins competition engine. The car ran a 1313 at 103.90 miles per hour, an improvement on ET and an improvement on mile per hour. But to know that this car is actually out there performing better than it did when it was an NHRA record holder, that's pretty amazing. So if you're wondering what happened to the Jolly Green Giant station wagon, it was sold to Jim Dorn in 1968, and he raced the car in Junior Stock Eliminator for a little while and actually held on to this car for quite some time. He had it stashed away in a barn for several years, and his son Joe actually took it out and completely rebuilt it as a street car. A few years ago, a guy by the name of Steve DeWoody from Texas asked the Gunning brothers if he could build a clone to the Jolly Green Giant. Of course, the Gunning brothers were okay with it, and they offered all sorts of pictures and information so that he could build the best possible clone of this car. To take this clone one step further and make it much more authentic, Steve was actually able to get in touch with Joe Dorn to get a hold of some of the leftover parts that he removed from the car when he made it a street rod. And then he was able to track down an NHRA legal engine from none other than Courtney Nelson, who was the original partner on the 57 four-door hardtop. The Gunning brothers rebuilt that engine to NHRA specs and shipped it out to Texas to be put into the Jolly Green Giant. That car made its debut at the 2021 Dan Chuck Tri-5 Nationals in Bowling Green, Kentucky, where I was able to take a few video clips of it to show just how close this thing is to the original. Next up is an extremely cool car. This is a 1964 Mercury Comet, and this is a factory-built drag car. So only 22 of these cars were produced, and they were built for the factory experimental class in NHRA. This particular one is restored, and it has tons of history. This is the Ronnie Sox car that he campaigned in 1964 before he switched over to Mopar in 1965. This thing was the originator of the Sox and Martin racing team, and you can see on the side of the car it was sponsored by Brinsfield Lincoln Mercury in Greensboro, North Carolina, and this was a lightweight car to begin with. These were pretty small cars, and you could get them with a V8, but you could not get them with the 427 cubic inch big block. And these things made big time horsepower, especially after guys like Ronnie Sox and Buddy Martin worked on them. These things were great combinations for drag racing. So part of the cool factor on these cars is not only the 427 engine, but these things had lightweight components straight out of the factory. So the fiberglass body components consisted of the front fenders, the doors, the trunk lid, bumpers, and a fiberglass teardrop scoop. These things were extremely lightweight cars. They also had plexiglass side windows to save even more weight. They had no heater, no radio, none of that kind of stuff. They were stripped of any sound deadening material. They were down and dirty. They were made for drag racing only. This thing has all the right pieces, including an original T10 4-speed transmission, 456 gear in the back. This car has original style traction bars on the back. It has the original lightweight seats, Hurst shifter, all the right stuff, including the tires. These are original style tires, just like what you would have seen in the mid-1960s. This car is restored beautifully, and it was restored by a guy here in Chattanooga, K.O. Irwin. He bought this car 25 years ago and went through the process of restoring it, and it is absolutely beautiful. This is a big money car, and it presents well, it's got great history, and it's extremely rare. Here's another extremely rare Ford from the K.O. Irwin collection. This is a 1963 Ford Galaxie 500, and it's a factory lightweight car. So these things were made for drag racing. And a lot of times these run in the super stock or the A stock categories, and this is a great example of that. This one is prepared for super stock. This one has a 427, 425 horsepower combination, high-rise aluminum intake, 2 4-barrel carburetors. It has an aluminum case Borg-Warner 4-speed transmission, and it has a special clutch that was developed by Dick Brandon, who is the guy who had this car. He raced this car and sold it for $750 in 1965. After all, it was just a used up old race car by that point. And then it was discovered 40 years later at an event in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. That was in 2005, and that's when K.O. Irwin bought it and restored this thing back to original as raced condition. You can see all the lettering, the steel wheels, the bi-sply tires. It's all correct and it's all been documented, including that side entry fiberglass ductwork that goes into that air cleaner setup. This thing has an original aluminum radiator, extremely rare for these lightweight cars. Lots of rare components, all put together in a historically accurate 63 Galaxy lightweight. Every old race car has history woven into every piece of it, and this one has come full circle. This is Larry Nelson's 55 Chevy utility sedan, which was a big contender in Superstock T in 1972, and after more than 40 years separated from this car, Larry got his hands on this thing again and completely rebuilt it just like it was in the 70s, with just a few modern touches to make this thing even better than before. And the good news is he's still rocking that 265 base small block engine. It's got a manual transmission in it, and it's got 614 gears out back. This thing has a cool combination of parts in it, and it's got a bunch of great history. Let's get into it. It's a 1955 Chevy 150 two-door utility sedan. This was the lightest car that you could possibly get from Chevrolet in 1955. That's what Larry Nelson started with, so he and a friend, Dwayne Brock, put their heads together on this car. In 1970, this car was pulled from a junkyard, and they pieced together an engine and a transmission, and they're building this thing by the book. They're building it by NHRA regulations to fit within that superstock category. So as this car came together, Larry was still serving in the Army, so Dwayne actually drove this car toward the end of the 1971 season. With the NHRA Summer Nationals in Englishtown being a premier event for Larry's region, he put a lot of effort into getting the car ready for the big race. But before the Summer Nationals, this car really hit its stride. The two loaded the car up and went to Killcare on a Saturday, where he beat Bob Glidden twice in a superstock race. Then they loaded up and went to Bowling Green, Kentucky the next day to race at another superstock race, where they went through a big field of cars and ended up taking home the win. But before they could go home with the winnings, they had to tear the engine down so the officials could make sure this thing was legal. When it was all said and done, they took home $800 for that superstock win in Bowling Green, and then just a few days later rolled into Englishtown for the Summer Nationals. Larry was on a warpath with this car, and his great performance continued into the Summer Nationals, where he went on to win Superstock T. So the way this would work out is he would compete for his class earlier in the event, and then on Sunday he would race against all the other class winners for a final eliminator. So he's having to race the big dogs here. He's not just racing the lower class cars, he's having to race them all. And he put out some big names on his way to winning this event. Not only did he win the event, he set a national record. So for this race, they were running off of a 1340 national record. That was kind of the basis for everything that they were doing in this particular class. So during the Summer Nationals, Larry ran a 1337, a 1410, a 1337, a 1342, another 1337, and then finally ended up running a 1320 in the final round to take the overall win and the Wally for the 1972 Superstock Eliminator at the Summer Nationals. I always love these old newspaper articles, and this is a good one here. Winner at Summer Nationals. And driver Larry Nelson of West Lafayette took the Superstock Eliminator title at the Summer Nationals in Englishtown, New Jersey recently. The 55 Chevy with a 265 cubic inch engine running in Superstock T class not only won the title, but lowered the class record from 13.38 seconds to 13.20. The win was worth between $5,500 and $6,500 to Brock and Nelson, partners for 2 years. And we're talking about just like a week span of racing, and this guy's got thousands of dollars in the bank account. And I mean, who wouldn't want to go professional drag racing after a week like that? Larry continued to have a great season in 1972. He ended up being runner-up at the NHRA World Finals, and then he won the National Dragster Open at National Trail Raceway, and he was relentless with this car. With great success in the 1972 season, Larry and Dwayne actually moved their drivetrain into a 55 Chevrolet station wagon. Now this moved them into a slightly different class, but it kept them in the lower ranks of the superstock division. So the 55 two-door sedan actually went to brothers Joe and Paul Smith from New Hampshire. The Smith brothers ran this car occasionally in the 1970s, but it was never at the level that Larry and Dwayne had it, and the car continued to live on for many years while Larry went on to build other race cars. And over the years, Larry stayed in contact with Joe Smith to kind of keep tabs on his old 55 Chevy. Larry asked Joe on a few occasions if he'd sell the car back, but he never had any luck with it, and he just kind of moved on. He moved on with racing, and he moved on with his career. But then Larry happened to see his car in a classifieds listing on a drag racing forum, and he was shocked because he had been talking to Joe for all these years about potentially buying the car back, and now suddenly this car was for sale. So the reality there is that Joe had had a heart attack and was having some other health issues, and his brother Paul wasn't aware of the agreement that Larry and Joe had come up with. There was a lot of interest in the car right off the bat, and several people were in line to buy this thing. And it ended up being NHRA stock racer Lynn Smith who got the call to get this car. Well, he knew that Larry wanted the car back and ended up making a deal with him, and it was all good. Larry was happy with the deal, Lynn was happy to arrange it, and this iconic super stock car came back to Ohio after all these years. Obviously, it was a little rougher than when it left Larry's ownership, but it was still a pretty solid car, and Larry had some ideas about what he was going to do to put this car back to the way it was in 1972. Larry had years to think about what he might do to this car if he got his hands on it again. So when he brought this thing back to Ohio, he already had a plan together, and he wanted to put this thing back to its winning ways from 1972, and then make a few little changes, but still be NHRA compliant. Starting with the chassis and suspension, Larry actually replaced the frame underneath his old 55 because it had some previous modifications that moved the leaf springs inboard back when this car was running in superstock in the 70s. So he wanted to have the leaf springs in the proper position and have a better frame altogether. So he put a different frame under this car, and he upgraded the front suspension with some Moroso trick springs and Calvert shocks. And then out back it's got Calvert mono leaf springs, it's got Calvert shocks and Caltrack bars. All of that is attached to a Chevy 12-bolt rear end, which is narrowed to 55 inches wide. And this rear end has a strange spool, strange axles, and 6 14 gears. Larry upgraded to strange disc brakes on the front and rear of the car, and then he put the old style tire and wheel combo back on this thing. He put skinny Kragers on the front with Moroso drag tires, 28 inches tall on those front runners. Then on the back he's got some black wheels with some 9-inch Hoosier slicks that fit right up under the quarter panels. This is a full weight, heavy street car basically with a small engine. So it's 265 cubic inches, but these classes were not separated by cubic inches, they were separated by a horsepower rating. So in the case of this 55 Chevy, it was running off of a superstock factor that looked at the original shipping weight of the car and the original horsepower rating of this particular combination. So this engine being a single 4-barrel 265, this was rated at 180 horsepower. So NHRA put together that factor and put together similarly prepared cars in that same class. So Superstock T could have had several different types of cars, but these Tri-5s were really popular in the late 60s and early 70s for these lower level stock eliminator classes. So these engines, even though they were rated by the factory at 180 horsepower, there was a lot of tricks you could do to squeeze more horsepower and still stay within the NHRA rules. And that's what Larry took into consideration when he built this combination. So you can overbore the cylinders by 80 thousandths, you can increase the stroke of the crankshaft by 15 thousandths of an inch. So instead of the original bore and stroke on a stock 265, which is 3.75 inches on the bore and 3 inches on the stroke, he increased the bore to 3.80 inches and he increased the stroke to 3.013 inches, within 2 thousandths of that rule that the NHRA put into place. Up top is a set of power pack cylinder heads. These are GM 520 castings. The heads have Manley 1.72 and 1.5 inch valves, Harlan Sharp 1.5 to 1 rocker arms, and then for the camshaft you're limited to the exact valve lift that the engine came with from the factory. So comp cams and some other cam companies make stock eliminator style camshafts. And these things have bigger duration, they have bigger specs, but they still have that original valve lift. So that's what he's got in here. And you can convert it from hydraulic lifter to a solid lifter, which is what a lot of the guys do. And then up top, it's actually got a stock 55 Chevy 265 4-barrel intake manifold and a stock 55 Chevy second design carburetor. Now there are updates you can do to these engines. Even though you want some of those pieces to be factory original, you can upgrade the fuel system with electric fuel pump, you can upgrade the ignition with modern pieces, and that's exactly what Larry did. It's got an Aeromotive fuel pump and regulator, it's got just a 5-gallon fuel cell from Jegs, of course, and it's got an MSD distributor, MSD Digital 6 Plus box, and an MSD coil. So this thing's got a combination of those really cool old school pieces and some modern stuff too to make it all work together. And then the headers are old school Stahl headers, 1 5/8 inch primaries. Of course it doesn't have mufflers. And then he put an aluminum radiator in there to keep this thing cool. So Larry Nelson built this engine, but he had Fowler Engines do some machine work for him. And then Dave Fields helped him tune this thing. So they've been working on this car for the past year, just tweaking it, tuning it, getting it really dialed in. And modern car guys are conditioned to think that any small block Chevy is going to make 400 horsepower without even breaking a sweat. But this full race prepared stock legal small block is making 258 horsepower at 6,238 RPMs. Now that's specific. And these things are specific. They're scientific. They are just down and dirty in the details to squeeze every ounce of horsepower out of these things. And by the way, it's making 217 foot-pounds of torque, and it runs on Sunoco 112 octane fuel. So here's an interesting detail that actually changed from 1972 to now. So in 1972, if you were running in the Superstock T class and you were running this 55 Chevy, that means you were running a 3-speed manual transmission. Now today, you can run a 4-speed transmission, which that opens up a whole new world of options for drag racers, and Larry ended up putting a Jericho 4-speed in this thing, which is perfect. That's exactly what this car needs, and it will allow this car to actually run better and be more reliable than it was in 1972. So you'll see the outside of this car is very slick, very nicely restored body on this thing, and that's the work of Tom Sondels there in Ohio. He straightened this car up and put it back into Nantucket blue with a white roof, and then he even did the old school speckle paint on the roof to make this thing just like it was back in the day. And then you'll notice the old school lettering just like it was. But what was really cool is when I found this picture, it's got 13.20 written on the windshield. So that was his index he was running off of at that race. And when I saw this car run at the Tri-5 Nationals in Bowling Green, he was running this thing on the same 1320 index. I had the pleasure of hanging out with Larry and his good friend Dave at the Tri-5 Nationals in Bowling Green. And this was really the first big race for the car. He had tested a little bit, but the first big race for this car was in front of a big crowd and against a lot of other cars that are similarly prepared. And Larry marched through the field of cars and he ended up taking home the win in his very first big race with the car. So he was absolutely thrilled. He was excited to do more and make this thing even quicker and faster. But it was super cool to see him take home a victory at a track that he had raced at 52 years before in this exact same car. special dealerships throughout the country could order these factory-prepared drag cars. One such car did not get a whole lot of publicity, and it was this one-of-one combination, a silver 1963 Dodge 330 sedan, and it came with the factory lightweight components. And when I say lightweight components, I mean an aluminum hood, an aluminum hood scoop, aluminum front fenders, aluminum front bumper, and aluminum front bumper supports. These cars also had the battery moved to the back of the car. They had factory exhaust cutouts. These things were legitimate factory race cars. In addition to the lightweight components, these things had serious horsepower. This car came with a 426 cubic inch max wedge engine. These things came with 13.5 to 1 compression from the factory. That's pretty wild to think about. Cross ram intake, 2 4-barrel carburetors, and believe it or not, these things actually had a push button automatic transmission. This one had the 727 push button on the dash, and that's how these guys raced them. There was no special trickery or anything like that. You drove it with those buttons, and these things were really deadly in the superstock ranks. So the most famous of these 63 lightweight cars were the Ram Chargers. They had 2 of these cars, and they dominated. The other cars, like this one, they went out there and held their own regionally, but when it came to national events, it was really tough to beat the Ram Charger guys. This car was ordered by Wayne Pierce, and he ordered it from King Dodge in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and this thing has all the right equipment. This car has been restored extremely well, and it's restored back to its 1963 configuration. In my research on this car, I was only able to find one picture from the 1963 NHRA Nationals in Indianapolis. And even though this isn't the greatest picture in the world, it's not quite in focus, the back of the car is cut off, you get the idea. They're really getting after it in this car, and look in the other lane. That's one of the 2 Ram Chargers in their factory lightweight Dodge just getting out ahead of them. This car continued to race through the years. You can see on the quarter window it actually has a 1973 and a 1974 participant decal, meaning that this thing continued to race throughout the years. And if you open the door, you can see the remnants of a roll bar. So when this car was restored, they removed the roll bar to put it back to 1963 configuration because they didn't run a roll bar back then. This thing is very authentically restored. You can see it's got factory type steel wheels on it. It's got pie crust slicks on the back. You can see the stance is up. That means that they've twisted those torsion bar adjustments to kind of get this thing standing up, and they naturally sat a little bit higher because there wasn't as much weight on the front end. And as you look at this thing, you can see a little bit of age and a little bit of patina on that front bumper. Now that aluminum could be polished to almost like a chrome finish, but this owner decided to leave it a little bit dull just to kind of give you that clue that this is a lightweight car. And he did a good job with the restoration. This thing is slick. It's got some great details, but if you look inside, the interior is actually the original red interior that came in this car. So the only things that have been added to the interior, you can see a tachometer, you can see a couple of Stewart Warner gauges that are in a custom little panel, and this thing is, you know, it's stripped down to the bones. It's radio delete, it's heater delete. This thing was as light as you could get one back in the day. So it's a really neat piece. It's just like stepping back in time to see what these cars were really like in 1963. This is a 55 Chevy, and it's been on the drag strip since 1972. Every year I go to the Tri-5 Nationals. It's at Bowling Green, Kentucky, historic Beach Bend Raceway, quarter-mile track with tons of cool history and a lot of great events. And Tri-5 Nationals ranks pretty highly in my book. So every year a bunch of cool old race cars come out and play, and this is a great example. This car belongs to Rene Garza. He's from Fort Wayne, Indiana, and he has owned this car since 1968. He bought this thing for 150 bucks. It's a 55 Chevy 210 two-door sedan. It has Del Rey interior, and it was originally a 6-cylinder car. This was just daily transportation for him during this time. So he was a freshman in high school at the time. He drove this car through high school, and by the time that was over with, he was ready to turn it into a drag car. As he started getting some ideas together on putting this thing on the drag strip, he became friends with a guy named John Lingenfelter. Now, I know you know that name because he is an absolute legend when it comes to Chevrolet horsepower, and he put his hands on a 265 cubic inch combination. They had a really strict rule book, and John Lingenfelter knew that rule book inside and out. And he knew the gray areas. He knew the areas that he could make big time horsepower and still be compliant with the rules. So he and Renee got together on this car and put together a really cool combination. You can see in these early pictures this car has a two-tone blue paint job on it. You can also see it's got a set of Krager Super Trick wheels on it, which were pretty new at the time. Early 70s, this was a pretty revolutionary concept to have these spun aluminum, very lightweight wheels. And of course that was a legal way to reduce the weight of the car. And the biggest challenge with this car early on was running an automatic transmission, because in the early 70s, there wasn't a lot of torque converter manufacturers like there are today. You didn't have a lot of choices to be able to get the RPMs up to get these cars off the line. That's why a lot of people ran 3-speed and 4-speed transmissions, because you could dump the clutch and take off with a lot of RPMs to get those little motors to carry these big heavy cars down the track. So through the years, that has developed a lot. The technology with torque converters and transmissions has made this thing get off the line a lot easier. But back in the day, they had to get creative on how they got this thing to launch. So originally he used a 12-bolt rear end and had some success with that, but the lowest gear ratio he could get was a 614, and that just wasn't quite enough to get the most out of this combination. We're talking about a 3,450 pound car with 265 cubic inches. So even with the most advanced engine combination, you're talking maybe 300 horsepower at the very most. So this combination was very difficult to get a handle on and difficult to be competitive in. So the next logical step was to go to a different rear end that would allow for an even lower gear ratio. And when he did that, he took it to Jegs Performance, and Larry Nelson was in charge of back halving this car. Now you might remember the name Larry Nelson because I did a video on his 55 Chevy about a year ago, and his car also 265 powered, but a little different school of thought because it has a manual transmission. Anyways, you should go watch that video. When you get done with this one, I'll put a link in there and you can go watch that one. It's a really cool story too. He put wheel tubs in the back to put a bigger tire under it. He put ladder bars to get rid of the original leaf springs, and he put a Dana 60 rear end, which had a lot more gear ratio options. And the sweet spot for this car ended up being a 683 gear. That's a crazy low gear ratio, even with a 32-inch tall tire, and even with this high winding little bitty small block Chevrolet, that's still a radical combination, and this thing is absolutely screaming at the top end. So that rear end swap happened in 1976, and you'll notice that this thing has a big tire under the back, but it doesn't look like it has a lot of wheel, and that's because they didn't narrow the rear end and they ran these special offset wheels that allowed them to fit it all in there. So no cutout fender wells like the Gasser days or anything like that. It's all tucked up under those quarter panels, and they did that with the special offset on the Krager Super Tricks originally. So we'll see as this car made changes through the years that they did change the wheel combination. They've run some weld drag lights on it, and the car currently has a set of monocoque wheels. They're extremely lightweight, and you'll see it does have that unusual offset on the back. So it's a stock width rear end with a really wide wheel and tire. Now these Superstock guys are serious when it comes to finding any possible advantage over the competition, and one place they found it was in the tires. So a lot of these Superstockers ran Firestone tires. They had the right compounds, the right sizes, the right rollouts, all the right stuff to give them that advantage over, let's say, Mickey Thompson or Goodyear or the other tires that came along. So in the case of this car, Renee ran a set of Firestones on it for many years, and eventually Firestone got out of drag racing, but those molds and those compounds actually went over to a new set of owners who changed the name to Phoenix Race Tires. And then eventually Coker Tire bought Phoenix Race Tires, and continued producing them with those legendary compounds that work so well on these cars. And that's what he's running on this car today. He's got a set of Phoenix front runners and a set of big tall Phoenixes on the back. These things work really well, they hook up good, and they last a long time. And because they're made in original molds with original compounds, they're historically accurate even though they don't say Firestone on the side. So one thing is consistent throughout the entire photo gallery of this car is the contingency decals. There are dozens of contingency decals on this car today, and there's always been a lot. There's Moroso and Competition Cams and all these different companies that would provide these decals, and then if you were photographed in the winner's circle and you were published in National Dragster or whatever other publication, they would mail you a check. So in addition to your earnings from your race win, you would get these contingency checks. And that was a big, big part of superstock racing. And it still is today, but back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, this was the way that these guys made a living. This car always had a lot of decals. You can see it still does. And that's because this car is still NHRA legal and he still races it in Superstock O automatic. Now he did have to move a class from P automatic to O automatic, and that's just through time some of those classifications change, but this thing is still largely the same as what it was way back in the day. So through the years the paint jobs changed. This thing originally was this two-tone blue, then it got another paint job with a sort of a two-tone red, two different shades of red, and then finally in 1991 it was painted with this red and white scheme, and that's what's still on this car. So if you go around to the back of it, there's a lot of cool hand lettering with gold leaf. It's beautifully done, and it's showing a little bit of age, but still very cool and a cool part of the history of this car. Another part of the history of this car is the emblem on the deck lid. That's an original dealership emblem from Parent Chevrolet in New Haven, Indiana. So another level of this car's history was revealed not too long ago. Renee was at the eye doctor whose last name happened to be Parent. And he didn't put two and two together that maybe that was related, but they got to talking about cars, and this 55 Chevy came up. Obviously, this car has been a part of Renee's life for many years now. And as they were talking about it, the eye doctor mentioned that he had a 55 Chevy, and it had a piston for a shift knob and some other little details that he talked about. And it really clicked with Renee because he remembered taking that piston shift knob off of the car when he started making this thing into a drag car. He took some of those parts and pieces off. So they both got a kick out of that. Another thing you'll notice on the back of this car is on that original chrome rear bumper are a lot of NHRA participant decals. Now, this thing ran at a lot of different races through the years, but you can see these big decals came from national events. So we've got decals from the Gator Nationals in Gainesville, Florida. We've got decals from the Spring Nationals in Columbus, Ohio. We got decals from the U.S. Nationals in Indianapolis. And these things are showing their age, obviously going back into the mid-70s on some of these decals. This is just a cool part of this car's history. On the inside, this is an interesting combination because it has an original bench seat with Delray interior, and then original dash, and a lot of original pieces, which was kind of required to run in the Superstock class. But you'll also see some modern electronics and some modern pieces kind of mixed in here. But one of the coolest things to me is the old 3-point roll bar. They've obviously added a door bar to that through the years to be compliant with NHRA rules. But it's cool that they didn't just cut all this out and start over through the years. They had every opportunity in the world to take this thing apart and really do everything up to modern standards, but the fact that some of these historic pieces are still surviving on this car makes it super cool to me. Under the hood of this car, there's an interesting combination, and it has to be because this car weighs 3,450 pounds, and to make this thing move, it's got to be making horsepower. So this thing started as a bow tie block, and it is now measuring the proper cubic inches to meet the NHRA Superstock rules. But they do a lot of tricks on the bottom end to get to that final displacement number to meet the rules. So this thing's got custom diamond pistons, Manley rods. It has a factory GM crank in it, 3-inch stroke. It's a really cool old school combination. And on top of that are 283 cylinder heads. Now they've been worked obviously within the NHRA rulebook, and it has a lot of good valve train components because this thing makes its peak horsepower way up in the RPM range. So the most interesting part visually of this engine is the intake and carburetor setup. So this thing has a single plane intake manifold, which is kind of a modern piece if you think about a 265 engine. And then this stack of carburetor spacers. Obviously, there's something in the rule book that says you can do this, because otherwise they wouldn't. So this thing's got a series of carburetor spacers. Some of them are cut on a wedge so that they're angled differently. And then on top of that is an original Carter 4-barrel carburetor. Again, that's within the rules. So moving further back, it's got a power glide transmission in it, built by Defiance Transmission. It has a TCI torque converter that revs to 7,000 RPMs on the line, and all of that works with that 683 rear end ratio. So this thing leaves the line with a lot of RPMs, and it stays up in the RPMs all the way down the track. And that's the best formula for these extremely small engine combinations. So through the tremendous effort that they've put into making this car quicker and faster and still be compliant for the rules, the best ET for this car is an 1146 at 113 miles per hour. And that's with a 151.60 foot time. And that's just incredible when you think about the parts and pieces that it took to get there. Now, 1146 may not seem very fast because you could take a brand new car off the showroom floor and do that, but we're dealing with 265 cubic inches, a big hunk of cast iron and a bunch of steel, and a big heavy car that's not aerodynamic with no technology whatsoever, and going out there and running that kind of number. It's very impressive, and this thing has a stack of accolades to show for it. He's won a bunch of races and won a bunch of money with this car, and now he's handed over the driving duties to his son Joey, who's still going out there and making passes with this car. Maybe not running at as many national events as they used to, but they're still putting laps on this old 55 just like it was the old days. I hope you enjoyed following along with the history of this super cool 55 Chevy Superstocker. Thank you for watching. While we're on the subject of Superstock, let's take a look at another historic Superstocker, another O automatic car. You can see the Scotty's Speed and Custom lettering on there, Bowling Green, Kentucky, and the name Steve Hinton lettered on the door, and a ton of decals. This is back in the day when all those decals really mattered on the national circuit. Those were contingency decals that paid you extra money on top of your winnings for representing those brands. So these old cars, like from the 70s and 80s and even the 90s, they're littered with sponsor decals because they got a little extra money whenever they were in the winner's circle. Here's another Superstock car. This one's a 150 two-door sedan, and you can see they're a little more strategic in their decal layout here. And you can also see this car's got a pretty fresh paint job on it. The reality with this car is that it is an old car, but they've put it back together with some fairly modern parts, and they come out here to the Tri-5 Nationals to race against all the other cars, whether it's Superstock or other cars in the drag racing ranks. They don't really have those different class breakouts like they do in the NHRA. It's a little more casual and laid back, but there's still some really great class cars that show up for the event. This is a 1965 Mercury Comet, and it's a factory-built drag car. Actually, it was built by Bill Strop. He's the one who was responsible for the AFX and BFX Mercury Comets. And this one is of the BFX variety. AFX cars had 427s, BFX cars had 289s. Now this particular one has the Cobra top end setup, which consists of Weber carburetors. It is a killer setup. A lot of these BFX cars ran very aggressive rear end ratios well into the fives, and this is a great example of one of these cars. These cars were extremely rare from day one, and a lot of them got cut up and turned into altered wheelbase cars and got scrapped for other cars or may have gotten wrecked. So there's very few of these things still in existence, and this one is legit. It's got the 289 engine. It has fiberglass body panels, so these things had a fiberglass hood, fiberglass fenders, fiberglass bumpers, and fiberglass doors. And a lot of them even had Lexan windows. So these things were weight reduced to the max. Now, I don't have any history on this specific car, but I do know that it was restored and raced in the 80s and 90s by Dave Coons. Now, he did the paint to match his other factory drag race Mercury Comet, which is an AFX car. So he had a matching pair of AFX and BFX 65 Mercury Comets. Unfortunately, the matching pair of cars got separated, but I'm glad to see this BFX car out and about getting seen by the public. Next up is a slick 69 Camaro in Hugger Orange. You can see those black hockey stick stripes. You got lettering on the side, but what's really cool about this car is the engine. This is a ZL1 based 427. Now, these engines were not really NHRA friendly, but they added a new class just a couple years ago called AAA stock. So this class was made for cars like this. This is a 69 Camaro with a ZL1 spec engine, although you'll see it does have a cast iron block instead of the aluminum, and that's just for durability and price. And we'll see on the quarter panel, it's got lettered on there, second-hand power speed shop. And they have thousands of parts for hot rods, drag cars, anything that goes fast, they got parts for it. And they use a lot of those parts on this car. And this thing is a stout combination. It's got a full cage. It's got some vintage pieces here and there. But for the most part, this is a modern day NHRA legal AAA stock automatic drag car. There were lots of NHRA legal cars at the Bowtie Nationals, including this second generation Camaro and the Nova that's sitting behind it here. Some really cool pieces. These things make big time horsepower, and they do it with a really strict rules package. They were a lot of fun to watch. Here's another NHRA legal car. This is a Superstocker 69 Camaro, green with hockey stick stripes. You can bet there's a big block under that cowl induction hood. This thing was super clean, had a cool look, and always left with the front wheels in the air. Next up is a 63 Chevrolet Biscayne. Now, this is the bottom of the line for Chevrolet's offerings in 1963. It's a two-door sedan, and these things were light. They were stripped down. They didn't have a lot of accessories, but this is what you'd do with it if you were going to go fast. You'd put a 409 with dual quads. Check out the big headers and the really rare air cleaner that's fed by the cowl. That's a really unusual piece. But just back up and look at this thing. Chrome reverse wheels, pie crust slicks on the back. This is a really cool combination. And when you look inside of it, it's bone stock. All red interior. There's not a whole lot to see here. There's no roll bar, no bunch of crazy speed parts or anything. Just a stripped out interior. And then on the outside, there's a few little accessories like the toe tabs on the front. And then, of course, the chrome reverse wheels really stand out on this bright red finish. And then all the signage on this car. A lot of these are decals, but still really cool on a 60s style build. This is a 56 Chevrolet four-door station wagon. And this is a national record holder. Even though now it kind of just looks like a street car, this car has some tremendous drag racing history. You can see it's got Stagecoach, Bowling Green, Kentucky on the quarter glass. And then on the door glass here, it's got Weibull Competition. Now, if you were involved in stock eliminator drag racing in the 60s and 70s, you knew the name Jim Weibull. He was a famous drag racer. He raced one of the Smothers Brothers cars, and he did a lot of great work on these things. And this is a product of that. This car was driven by Dickie Ogles back in the day, and it's still alive today, being driven on the streets of Kentucky. Now, here's a really neat old drag car. This thing looks like it's fresh off the showroom floor. I think you could change the wheels out and take this to any car show out there. But check this out. This is an in-stock automatic stock eliminator car. So this thing is a 302 with a two-barrel. Look under the hood right here. Two-barrel carburetor, bone stock 302 with just those stock eliminator tricks that they're allowed to do. And you could tell it had those super stock tricks underneath because this thing planted the tires, raised the front end up in the air, and just went down the track. Even though it didn't make a lot of horsepower, it's still pretty entertaining to watch. I actually got to talk to the owner and the driver of this car, and it was just a great experience. And I enjoyed spending some time with him, hearing some of his stories and some of his experiences with this car. And the really cool part about this thing is that he bought it brand new. The owner of this car, his name is Terry Woodbridge, and he has been racing this car basically since it was new. I mean, he did drive it around some when it was new, but for the most part, this has been a toy. It's been a drag car, and it's been a stock eliminator car. It's got a 543 gear in the back. I mean, it's got some really neat stuff, and the fact that he's been drag racing this thing for the better part of 50 years is really cool. And it still looks so good. The tire and wheel package is really cool, and that bright red paint, that is the original paint. He said this car has been garaged since 1973. And even though he's drag raced it, he still took very good care of it, and he has preserved this thing to the best of his ability, and it shows. And I'm so glad I got to spend a little time with Terry and learn a little bit more about this very special car.
That is cool.
Only 14 of these Swiss cheese Pontiacs were built in 1963 before General Motors pulled the plug on their factory racing program, and this one is by far the most famous example as it was raced by Arnie Beswick, a legendary Pontiac racer from the 1960s and 70s. Let's take a look at what makes these cars so special and dig into the history of this particular car as it went through the years and passed through different owners, and eventually ended up in a private collection in Georgia. As the superstock wars are raging, General Motors, Ford Motor Company, and Chrysler Corporation all had their own factory lightweight cars. So when the 1963 models rolled around, Pontiac took it to extremes by taking everything you could take away from a car, including structural integrity, and then putting their famous 421 Super Duty engine in this lightened full-size car. They put aluminum inner and outer fenders on the front. They put aluminum bumpers front and rear, aluminum bumper brackets, aluminum radiator support, and aluminum hood. And they even put aluminum things like the aluminum bell housing. Some of the cars even came with an aluminum center section for the rear end, and they even had aluminum exhaust manifolds, which took the weight down from 72 pounds with the cast iron manifolds to 27 pounds. So all 14 of these cars were silver in color. The first 12 were called Fire Frost Silver. That was actually Cadillac color. The last two that were produced were Silver Mist Gray. All 14 of them were blue interior. All of them were radio delete. All of them were heater delete. They were stripped down to the bone. So let's take a quick moment to address the nickname Swiss cheese. Now these cars were lightened in many ways, including those aluminum fenders and aluminum body components, but Pontiac took it one step further by actually lightening the frame on these cars. These are full frame cars, and they typically would have a boxed rail, but instead of a boxed rail on these Swiss cheese cars, they would actually take one of the plates out, making it more of a U shape, and then they drilled more than 120 2 3/4 inch holes in the frame rails and basically every piece of the frame to lighten it up, taking metal away from it to lighten it up. So, you know, that took away some structural integrity. These cars weren't fit for use on the highway, but they were absolutely perfect for drag racing. Each car was a little bit different. Some of the cars had plexiglass windows, some of the cars had regular glass, some of the cars had the aluminum center section, some had a nodular iron, some of them had a cast iron 3-speed transmission, but the one we're looking at today, Arnie Beswick's car, was ordered with a T10 4-speed, so it had an aluminum case on the 4-speed. And then of course the special version of that 421 engine, this thing had 13-to-1 compression. It had a special McKellar cam. It had dual Carter AFB carburetors, and there was even a special tunnel ram style intake that was available over the counter. So these engines were really potent right out of the factory, but if you tuned on them and tweaked on them and did the normal superstock tricks, you could get 500 plus horsepower out of these things, even though they were only rated for 405 horsepower. And to go back to the superstock ranks in the 1960s, the class designations were split up by advertised horsepower. You could still squeak out several horsepower out of head work and things like that that would go unnoticed in the tech line. At 3,300 pounds, that would put you way down in the 12s in legal superstock form. But a lot of these guys would match race these cars kind of in between national events. They would match race at different tracks, and the gloves were off. You could do whatever you wanted in a match race situation. Arnie Bestwick got paid to show up and race other factory lightweight cars, AFX cars, superstock cars, gassers. Anybody that would line up against him, some of these tracks would pay him appearance money to show up, plus whatever money he would get for winning the race. So this car actually ran down into the 11s in match race form and raced in the 12s in legal superstock form. And that brings us to another point that's very special about this Arnie Bestwick car. It actually has a different spindle on it than the other Swiss cheese Pontiacs. It's got a taller spindle, which actually changes the geometry of the front suspension, which transfers weight to the rear tires. And then a special traction bar was added to the back of the car, which helped to control the squad and helped really stabilize that rear end housing. This car and Arnie Bestwick worked really well together and won a lot of races in 1963. If you're enjoying this video, do me a favor and hit that thumbs up button. Feel free to leave a comment below and hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. Through the years, Arnie Bestwick had connections with Pontiac dealers all over the country. And you'll see in the early pictures of this 63 Catalina, it actually had Seltzer Pontiac lettered on the doors. And there's actually a little bit of confusion if you start researching Arnie Bestwick's car. You might run into some pictures of Larry Johnson's car because they look very similar. Obviously, they were all silver, but they look very similar because on the quarter panel, it says Passionate Poncho. But on Larry Johnson's car, it says home of the Passionate Poncho. And on Bestwick's car, it says Mr. B's Passionate Poncho 3. So a little bit of confusion there and a little bit of a tie in there with Larry Johnson and the Johnson Pontiac dealership because they did come up with that Passionate Poncho name together a couple years before. On a side note, Larry Johnson's Catalina ended up getting cut up into an altered wheelbase car. So the long rear overhang on these cars got even longer with moving the rear axle forward. During this time, Arnie Bestwick would drive to the track with two cars in tow. He would typically have a car for one class and a car for another class. And sometimes whether it was a match race or a national event or whatever, you know, if one car broke, he could still be in the game. Or, you know, it increased his odds of winning by having two cars. Even though General Motors pulled the plug on that factory drag racing program, Arnie continued to support Pontiac because that combination worked for him. But the reality was that drag racing was moving fast in 1963 and going into the 1964 season. The factory experimental class was evolving quickly, and then there was a whole new group of cars coming out that were supercharged, running on nitromethane, you know, dragster type driveline in a full-bodied car. These cars would eventually sort of mesh with the altered wheelbase AFX cars and become what we now know as funny cars. But during this time, I mean, things were changing really fast. And, you know, he moved on from this Catalina and he sold it to another drag racer. His name was Andy Perry. He was from DeWitt, Iowa, and he continued to race the car. It would still remain silver. And in this picture, you'll also see the back tire is off of the car, and you can see the holes in the frame rails, and you can also see an extensive traction bar system on the rear suspension on this car. So Andy ended up selling the car to Ray Bizig from the Chicago area, and he ended up putting a really unique combination in this car, and he continued to drag race it for several years. And he had a D-stroked engine in here that was pretty small in cubic inches. It was only 319 cubic inches as listed on the fender here. And this thing would launch super hard. I mean, look at this launch picture. This thing's got all the front suspension droop that you could ever want because of those special spindles. Even though this car had been updated slightly, it was still pretty true to its roots. It hadn't really been cut up or anything. A lot of those factory lightweight components were still intact. Some of those old suspension pieces were still intact, including those special spindles. But the only thing that had been added here was a roll bar, which is still in this car to this day. That hasn't been taken out of it. But this car remained a really significant piece of drag racing history because the different owners through the years, they didn't get rid of those factory lightweight components. They didn't cut up the back of the car as far as putting huge tires under the back. They didn't do very much as far as changing this very significant car. So fast forward a few years and Ray puts this car up for sale, and Bill Blair, who's a Pontiac enthusiast, he's built Pontiac racing engines, he's been around Pontiacs his whole life, he ended up making a deal with Ray on this car and bought it in 1987. At that point, Bill put the lettering back to the way it used to be. Aside from Arnie Beswick's name, he left that off for a few years. He put his name on the windows because he was actively racing this car at Nostalgia Drag Races. And this thing was running deep down into the 11s. I mean, this car, he was beating on it. He was running it hard. Eventually, the racing kind of fizzled out, and he just held on to this car for quite a few years. He had another significant Pontiac lightweight drag car, and these two cars just kind of fit together. But eventually, he sold the car to Jerry Kelly from Adel, Georgia. He has a collection of pretty significant cars as well, and I was able to see this car up close and personal at the Savoy Auto Museum in Cartersville, Georgia. They had a special exhibit on factory drag cars, and it was amazing. There was some cars there that I had never seen before, including this Swiss cheese car. I'd never seen a Swiss cheese car in person. Not many people have. I hope you enjoyed following along with me. Thank you for watching.